Arnold Jorge. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Arnold Jorge from the Export Council of Australia. I'm pleased you're able to join us today. Before we begin the proceedings, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. Where I am, here in Canberra, I pay respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present. I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance today. May I now ask Dr. Cassia Williams, Deputy Director of the Centre for European Studies at the Australian National University, to make the welcome remarks. Thank you, Cassia. Cassia, you're on mute.
Thank you, Arnold. Good afternoon and welcome. I also would like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region and all First Nations Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and work, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our webinar today. Distinguished guests and colleagues from the diplomatic community, the government, academia, and public sector, and all of you who join us today to learn more about this important topic, climate change and international trade. As the Deputy Director of the Centre for European Studies at the Australian National University, it gives me great pleasure to officially open today's webinar, which we host in collaboration with our partners, Export Council of Australia, St. Louis University in Brussels, and University of Canberra. The ANU Centre for European Studies is the oldest research centre in Australia focused on the study of Europe and the European Union. Our centre is an ANU-wide platform for research and collaboration with Europe, with strong links to government and industry. We engage in and promote inter and transdisciplinary dialogue and deliver research, education, and outreach with the support of Erasmus Programme of the European Union. Today's seminar is part of one of our projects, the Jean Monnet project EU Climate Change Agenda in External Trade and Investment. Dr. Ivana Damjanovic, who is one of our visiting fellows from the University of Canberra, is the lead investigator on this project and one of the conveners of the webinar today. This project and today's event is a great example of the work we aim to do to enable and foster a dialogue between academics, policymakers, industry representatives, and a broader community. Before I conclude, I would like to draw your attention to the project website. You'll find additional information, materials, already 2 briefing papers published, and more resources coming soon. We will circulate the link to the website in the chat during the event and provide contact details on slides at the end of each session. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Kasia. The webinar today will be in 2 parts. The first part will be mostly a discussion on the intersection of trade and climate change as represented by Cbam, and what actions Australia might be taking in preparation of global efforts to price emissions. And the second part will be a detailed deliberation on the elements and potential impacts of Cbam. For this, I will hand the emceeing reins to Professor Darren Sinclair, Director of the Centre for Change Governance at the University of Canberra at 4:15 this afternoon. I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers and panelists, and they are in order of appearance. Dr. Ivana Damjanovic, lecturer from the University of Canberra's Faculty of Business, Government and Law. Mr. Scott Wyatt, advisor from the delegation of the European Union to Australia. Professor Nicolas de Sadelier, who is Jean Monnet Chair and Professor of EU Law at the Université St. Louis, Brussels. Dr. Lily Lim Camacho, lead for CSIRO Handprint. Mr. Demas King, General Manager, Trade, Investment and Investor Relations, Minerals Council of Australia, and Jeremy Green, Assistant Secretary, Multilateral Trade Policy Branch at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So we have indeed an impressive panel, but in the interest of time, I won't go through their backgrounds. Their bios have been circulated, so please peruse them at your convenience. This session will run as follows. I will invite each panelist to make a brief remark outlining their key messages. We will delay questions until the panel discussion. During the panel discussion, I will put to our experts questions we received in advance from our audience. Due to the tight time frame, I ask speakers to keep your remarks brief and to the point. Please keep to your allocated time. Our first speaker will be Ivana, followed by Scott, and then Nicholas. They will provide the context and background to Cbam. Ivana, if you're ready, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Arnold. And my core message will be about the trade as an economic activity that needs to contribute addressing climate change. So until recently, climate change and trade have been mostly considered in silos in terms of multilateral efforts. So if we look at the 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement, we won't find any clause there devoted to trade. And similarly, if we look at the issue of climate change at the level of WTO per se, that issue is not part of the WTO's ongoing work program, and there are no WTO specific rules on climate change. As part of the Doha mandate, however, the WTO members agreed to negotiate greater market openings in environmental goods and services. And there are indeed high expectation, especially among developed countries, that the WTO will contribute to the green transition, which is needed to achieve climate and environmental objectives. And for example, the EU's ambition in that respect is to integrate the sustainable development goals into the WTO. And there are indeed efforts underway to reactivate and broaden the negotiations on environmental goods and services, which are also supported by the new WTO director. At the bilateral level, free trade agreements usually include a chapter on trade and sustainable development with references to multilateral environmental agreements. And countries also look to use FTAs to include commitments which would facilitate and promote trade and investment in environmental goods and services, and particularly those that are climate friendly, including both tariff and non-tariff barriers. And more recently, EU trade agreements make also reference to Paris Agreement targets. And in this sense, trade policy could really serve as a leverage to achieve compliance with national target emissions, which are specified in the Paris Agreements. Sustainability is certainly one of the core aspects of the EU's new trade policy, and trade policy being seen as an important role, having an important role in supporting the green transition and promoting responsible and sustainable value chains. And in that sense, the Commission will also seek to get commitments from the group of G20 on climate neutrality, biodiversity, sustainable food policy, pollution, and circular economy. So when we talk about EU Cbam, it should be actually put into that, considered into that broader context of EU's climate targets and the role that trade has to play in achieving those targets. So European Commission announced the proposal to introduce Cbam, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, in July. And Cbam will effectively impose a levy on imports to the EU of those products whose production emits more carbon than the production of like products, which are produced in the EU and whose producers are subject to stricter emissions standards under the EU emissions trading scheme. So when adopted and implemented, Cbam would be the first such climate-related trade restriction, but certainly would not be the last one. Reactions to Cbam have been mixed. A number of countries of the global south have expressed their concerns, declaring that Cbam could be protectionism disguised as climate action. And in the global north, the reactions have been mixed as well. For example, the US climate envoy John Kerry warned that Cbam should be the last resort, but at the same time, when the Commission introduced its proposal, the Democrats introduced their proposal for a polluter import fee. While this proposal is still at the level of a policy proposal, of importance is that in the US there is currently no permit trading system or tax at the federal level. So if we look at the issues of WTO compatibility, it would be difficult to see how could the US impose a fee on pollution caused by imported products without imposing an equivalent fee on the pollution caused by the competing domestic products. The Europeans in that respect can at least point to the ETS as an equivalent internal measure. Elsewhere, Japan and Canada are also working on similar mechanisms to the EU's. So I'll hand over now to Scott, and who will tell us more about the EU's proposal. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivana. It's Scott here. Guys, apparently the host has turned off my video, so if we can rectify that, that'd be great. Okay, here we go. Right. Okay, cool. Okay, thank you everybody for the opportunity to participate. So I'm going to, in the very short time available, speak to the context and the rationale for the carbon border adjustment mechanism. From now on, we're talking about Cbam as an acronym. So most on the video conference will be aware of something called the European Green Deal. This was presented by the European Commission in December 2019. It's essentially a growth strategy and a vision for a fair, prosperous society and a resource efficient and competitive economy. Importantly, it puts forward an objective of the EU achieving net zero emissions by 2050. It also raises the possibility of a WTO compliant carbon border adjustment mechanism in the event that ambition levels around the world don't match that of the EU. So if we fast forward to today, we now have in the EU a climate law which enshrines in legislation the target of achieving climate neutrality by 2050 and the target of achieving an emissions reduction goal of at least 55% by 2030 from 1990 levels. So that's an increase from the existing 40% target. Can we have the first slide up, please? So at the moment, we have in place already a system to achieve the existing 40% emissions reduction target. Well, that then begs the question, if the EU is now committed to a 55% target, well, how are you going to get there? That's what this slide is all about. So the European Commission, the executive arm of the EU, has put forward what it considers an optimum mix of pricing targets and rules. So just to pick a couple, for example, if you look at the top right-hand side column there, you'll see CO2 standards for cars and vans. There's an existing CO2 standard for cars. The proposal puts forward an additional target for 2030, a higher target for 2030, and a de facto target for 2035 for cars, for example, to be all zero emission cars by that date. Importantly, if we look at the middle column there, you'll see updated effort sharing regulation. The effort sharing regulation sets out binding targets for all of the member states that fall outside of the EU ETS. So for example, the new proposal has targets for each member state ranging from a 10% reduction up to a 50% reduction. On the EU ETS side of things, I'd just like to run through a couple of things about the EU ETS to begin with as a basis. So in fact, the polluter pays principle has been enshrined in the treaties. The Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union discusses the polluter pays principle. The EU ETS is a cap and trade system. It covers the 27 member states of the European Union, plus Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. There's now a link to the Swiss EU ETS. There are 11,000 installations. The scheme covers approximately 40% of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions. It covers electricity generation and energy-intensive industries. Auctioning is the default rule. So in terms of the proposals, the key point here is that there are a number of proposals that are being put forward in respect to the EU ETS, but the one I'd emphasize is that we are expecting or putting forward a increase in the decline in the cap. The EU ETS, as I said, is a cap and trade scheme, and we're wanting to see the cap decrease at a swifter rate. So when one has a carbon price in place in one jurisdiction, but not in another jurisdiction, you face the problem that companies can potentially relocate production to that outside country where the carbon price is not applying. And this can lead to a global increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And similarly, you can have a situation where products are purchased preferentially from places that do not impose a carbon price. So this is essentially carbon leakage, which is a very important point germane to this discussion. Can we have the next slide up? Thanks. So at the moment, how has the EU dealt with the question of carbon leakage? Well, we have allocated freely. We have free allocation to a list of sectors and subsectors that are considered at risk of carbon leakage. Well, this has worked to a large extent, but then raises the issue. You then have a very weak carbon price signal, even though the free allocation occurs on a basis of the most efficient top 10% performers. The carbon price is negligible. Therefore, what Cbam is all about is essentially aiming to phase out free allocation for the covered sectors and phase in Cbam at a pro rata rate. So the covered sectors, the sectors that Cbam is going to cover are electricity, iron and steel, aluminium, fertiliser and cement. So as you can see in the slide in front of you, there's a proposal for a phase-in period starting from January 2023 and ending in December 2025. And during that time, importers will be required to declare the direct and indirect emissions of the shipments, of the embedded carbon in the shipments, as well as any carbon prices that are applying. At the end of the transitional period, the European Commission is going to undertake a review that will consider the possibility of expanding the scope of Cbam to indirect emissions. At the moment, it's only going to cover direct emissions, and possibly to other sectors, so sectors other than the ones that I've just listed before. So from 2026, free allocation in the EU ETS for those sectors that I mentioned is going to be phased out in 10% increments over 10 years. And at the same time, importers will be required to surrender Cbam certificates in a direct proportion. And these Cbam certificates will be based on the actual verified embedded emissions, and there's the possibility to use default values if the importers can't provide sufficient information in regards to the actual embedded emissions. A very important point, the carbon price paid by the producers of the products can be deducted or will be deducted from the Cbam obligation. So we can have carbon prices, of course, in the form of EU ETS or carbon taxes. So essentially, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is a WTO compliant measure to address carbon leakage. It's an environmental measure. I'll just speak briefly to the question of agriculture because that's come up in a number of our discussions. So agriculture is not part of the EU ETS and there's no consideration for it therefore becoming part of Cbam. So agriculture actually falls under the effort sharing regulation that I referred to earlier in the discussion. And the EU, at an EU level, we use other policy instruments to address agricultural emissions. So for example, through the Common Agricultural Policy, there's a recent farm to fork strategy that, for example, discusses nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer, this kind of thing. And there's also a methane strategy that discusses enteric emissions from ruminants, things like that. So that's enough to go on with for now. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Nicholas, you have the floor.
Yes. First and foremost, I would like to thank the University of Canberra, in particular Professor Raff, for inviting me last real time as a visiting professor at the university. Secondly, although I've been giving a number of conferences and lectures in your country, I didn't catch the Australian accent. Sorry for that. Thirdly, my colleague Ivana Damjanovic and myself shall delve later on the legal and political aspects of Cbam in relation to the carbon market trading system. And I will remind that we are academics and we don't speak on behalf of an EU institutions. In case I have to explain the carbon market scheme to my students, my first word will be, it's a long road to who, as the English saying goes. It's a long road to who. Why? Because the scheme has been discussed in the course of the 1990s, and there were two options on the floor, either a carbon tax or carbon market mechanism inspired by the sulfur American model. The tax scheme appeared to be stuck on the ground that the ministers, the European ministers, can adopt a tax scheme in as much as there is unanimity. And the British oppose any tax schemes regarding the emissions from products. Against that background, the EU lawmaker decided to adopt a directive in 2003 that entered into force only on the 1st January 2005. And that directive has been laying down the floor for the most ambitious carbon market scheme on the planet. Of course, this has not been an easy task. That directive has been modified, amended a number of times in order to be linked with the Co2 protocol, in order to expand its scope to new installations and aviations. And the directive has been giving rise to a numerous litigations on the account that the directive has been implemented by 27 different national authorities. And a directive is also a matter of compromise because the European Union does not amount to a state or to a federation or confederation. It's a union between 27 member states. And the compromise at the outset has been, okay, the member states are going to grant the allowances to emit greenhouse gases from plants for free, with no way to grant something through auctioning sales. That system did not provide the best results. Against this background, in 2013, the lawmaker decided to push forward for auctioning, as it was stressed by the former speaker. So auctioning has been smoothly replacing the granting for allowance for free or grandfathering. So what we are facing now, it's on the one hand, a more stringent EU cap on emissions with a view to achieving the 2030 minus 55% greenhouse gas emissions against the 1919 background and climate neutrality by 2050. And that requires the phasing out of grandfathering of free allowances that have to be replaced by this auctioning of the allowances to the 14,000 plant operators across Europe. The auctioning is likely to increase significantly the price of the allowances and so make the products produced in these plants far less competitive against, for instance, South Korean or Chinese products. So the Cbam that we will discuss, my colleague and myself, is seen as an alternative to cope not with installations being based abroad, but with products similar to the products produced by the installations operated in Europe. Of importance is to understand that EU law is fairly decentralized. The member states are the main actors, be it with respect to the carbon market or with Cbam. And so we shall stress the importance of the competence that have been granted so far and that will be granted to the different national authorities. So the hardcore message will be, on the one hand, the carbon market scheme starting in 2005 gave rise to trading of allowances across the EU. Cbam is another story. It's an alternative. It's not going to give rise to any trading. It's going to complement the trading scheme that's already existing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivana, Scott, Nicholas. There's a lot to digest there. So audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. Hopefully our panelists will be able to address them at least later in the segment, or hopefully they'll be able to discuss them in more detail in the second part of the webinar. So may I now invite Lily and Demas to provide perspectives on agriculture and mining, two of Australia's largest industry sectors and major economic contributors. Welcome, Lily.
Thank you very much, Arnold. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for this opportunity to share with you our thoughts on impacts of Cbam on agriculture. I'd like to share with you a couple of slides just to summarize some of the key points that I'd like to share today. As we've seen, as been mentioned earlier, the Cbam is not going to impact on agriculture directly. However, Australian agricultural exports to the EU are quite high, with almost 50% of that being canola as a biofuel. The top 5 exports to EU comprise of about 80% of the total export value to Europe, which means that there will be certain commodities that will be more impacted than others if there is an impact. We do know that there is a shift away from food sources as biofuels as part of the Renewable Energy Directive. That's been going on for quite a while now. And as mentioned earlier, the Cbam is only one of the mechanisms that actually are there to reduce the emissions in Europe. And therefore, we should be mindful of the other mechanisms that could come in place as well. The other thing is that consumer pressure on certain commodities might actually speed up the impacts of this. We know that there's a lot of talk about methane emissions and what the beef industry contributes to that. We also know that in certain high-value commodities such as wine, there is a stronger consumer expectation to have lower impact. So sometimes it may not be an initial impact that Cbam would want to have, but actually it will create the flow-on effects to others. Lastly, agriculture is not a standalone industry. It relies on many other sectors for it to function. The fact that fertilizers are part of are going to be impacted by Cbam means that there will be flow-on effects again to agriculture. It may not be to Australia, but it could be for commodities in Europe. And therefore, it might create actually competitive advantages for our products. So what are we expecting to see as a result of this? We think that our competitors in agriculture will get into shape. They'll be forced to do things for other sectors, and therefore will have impacts on agriculture too. It means that we need to get going, get cracking in terms of understanding what our emissions are and lowering them. Our carbon market in Australia is likely to be impacted, mainly because carbon pricing is a factor when it comes to the calculation of the tariffs around Cbam. So if, for example, we see that greater tariffs, higher prices in Europe are essentially informing what the tariffs are, and we have a very low price here in Australia, it's likely to balance out if you think of it. Therefore, there will be a stronger push towards carbon farming. Again, broader market mechanisms will come into play. And lastly, some sectors in agriculture are more ready than others. Certain industries such as beef have always been under the spotlight and therefore know how to actually look at their emissions. Canola, for example, which is the rapeseed that you've seen earlier, have been doing this for quite a while now. And every 3 years, we actually review emissions, and CSIRO has been part of that. But certain industries are not prepared, and they're less, they have less resourcing to actually do this, and have not been looking at their sustainability frameworks, and only just starting. And I think that's where the opportunities lie for us to actually enact that, get our benchmarking happening for emissions so that we're ready for what is likely to come very, very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. Demas would be very interested to hear the mining industry's viewpoint.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you again for the opportunity to talk today. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. As currently sketched out, the Cbam proposed by the EU is unlikely to have a significant impact on the resources sector in Australia, and if and when it comes into being, part of that will be determined by whether or not it is expanded beyond the current sectors. It's fair to say the resources sector has quite a small proportion of its exports going direct to the EU, but really it's very difficult to pin down, just to step back, small exposure to the EU, but it's really about where producers sit on the cost curve compared to others. If this carbon border mechanism is also adopted more broadly across the world. If I could just touch on a couple of things around the Cbam as it's currently structured. It's yet to be finalised, so it's very difficult to pin down exactly what the impact will be. Despite it being suggested that it meets the WTO requirements, until the design is finalised, it's pretty difficult to determine that. It would need to be expanded, and if it is expanded, that may well have an impact on exposure in mining. But really, the model presents a more significant risk to trade where it is repurposed as a trade protection mechanism, either else in the EU case or elsewhere around the world, instead of a genuine push for the reduction of emissions. And I want to talk about that in the context of the accelerating geopolitical and trade shifts we've seen over the past decade, where free and fair trade and open investment markets have been under considerable pressure. I think this becomes even more important as the globe scrambles for a secure supply of minerals critical to economies and the technologies the world will need to decarbonise, grow and prosper. And just focusing on the technologies and the minerals that are going to be required for decarbonisation, that has really been the focus of the mining industry over the last decade and continues to be our focus. What minerals are going to be critical to renewable energy technologies and other advanced technologies, critical minerals such as rare earth elements, lithium, nickel, cobalt for the batteries that are required in a decarbonised world, copper for electric vehicles, electricity systems and electrification more broadly as we move into a decarbonised environment. Iron ore and the technical solutions that are required to decarbonise the production of steel and the steel needed for the industrial systems of the future, silver for telecommunications, gold for medical and technology applications, uranium and the new nuclear energy technologies available for emissions-free energy. The whole spectrum of shifts that are occurring at a technology level are things that are in front of mind of the miners as they look to the various investments that they might make to develop the resources that are needed. I think the other thing that I would want to say is that the minerals industry has been very active in terms of putting in place an action plan for climate action. It launched its climate action plan in June 2020, and that set out a clear commitment to achieve a net zero emissions and to share the knowledge and experience across minerals industries and build on momentum already underway. All MCA members support climate disclosures, the Paris Agreement, and the transition to net zero emissions. And the spectrum of targets for net zero emissions extend to 2050. So there is a significant proportion of the mining sector in Australia and globally that have already set down very firm commitments. And they're starting to look at the technologies and adopt the technologies that will get them there. The progress report in 2021 set out the various 39 abatement activities that are actively underway at various operations, extending from the adoption of hydrogen fuel cells for stationary electricity and machinery, right through to fuel switching, hybrid diesel and out of diesel altogether. So there's, and again, energy efficiency and the adoption of renewable energy purchases by procurement or on-site infrastructure developments. So there is an awful lot happening in terms of decarbonising the various operations, but there's also much more that's being done over the last 5 years on partnering downstream, partnering with Nippon Steel, for example, to look at low carbon emission steel value chains, partnering with POSCO to look at technologies to transition to a low carbon emission steel value chain, looking at partnership with China Baowu and universities in China to develop and implement new technologies in that regard. So not only are the miners looking at reducing emissions within their operations, but they're also looking ahead to the technologies that are needed for the reduction of emissions in those areas of industry that will need to reduce the emissions towards a zero emissions world. I might pause there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Demis. Finally, Jeremy, are you able to share DFAT's take on Cbam?
Thanks, Arnold. Can I just check you can hear me okay? Great. Conscious of the time and meeting into the panel discussion, but also the beauty of going last, of course, is that many speakers have already touched on some of the things that I was going to raise, but I'll try and summarise for you both the Australian government's view to date on Cbam, some of the things we're looking out for, and should there be time, a couple of the alternatives we're looking at, although that we could leave that to the panel discussion as well. So, you know, Australian government's been quite clear, ministers have been quite clear in registering concern over the Cbam policy, particularly following its release in July. It is true, as Demis pointed out, and I think Lily as well, that the immediate impact of Cbam, given its current scope, appears to be quite small. But there are a number of things that we are watching and are concerned about. This includes the indirect impact on Australian exports, particularly where they, such as mining and resources, form part of a value chain in third country exports to the EU. The potential expansion of Cbam, as Scott mentioned, in terms of both product and scope of emissions coverage. what's happening in other jurisdictions as well, and take Ivana's point that things are going on in other places like Canada, Japan, and potentially the United States. We're also watching closely the impact of Cbam on multilateral cooperation in trade and climate change fora more generally. We noted US climate envoy John Kerry cautioned about not advancing too quickly in advance of COP26. And we've heard a number of countries express concerns in the WTO, OECD, G20, these sorts of forums about border carbon adjustment mechanisms more broadly. And as Deems pointed out, given the strong relationship between Cbam scope on the one hand and the domestic emissions trading scheme on the other, we're also concerned about the possible protectionist impact or potential of Cbam and its discriminatory impact on trade. So just to give a sense of some of the features of Cbam we're looking at, and indeed, I should say, talking with the EU, with the Commission about, and we're grateful for their consultation or their discussions with us. So I should acknowledge that the final form of the Cbam, it's hard to tell, and there's a lot of water to flow under the bridge at the Commission between member states and with the Parliament, and we acknowledge that. As Deems mentioned, implementation is still a question. There's a lot of detail which is yet to be released. But the sorts of things we're looking at include the phase-in period between 2023 and 2025, and in particular, what administrative burdens Cbam may place on EU importers and Australian exporters, particularly for small and medium enterprises who will be forced to estimate and record the emissions embedded in their traded goods. The review proposal, as Scott mentioned, in terms of both scope of product coverage and indirect emissions, how the phase out of the exemptions for the domestic ETS will work in parallel with Cbam, again, as Scott spoke about. And finally, how the EU will measure the emission, or the Commission will measure the emissions embedded in traded goods. We note at the moment that Cbam in particular seems to discount charges where the country of origin good has a domestic carbon price, and only in those circumstances. So the draft regulation does not appear, at least to our reading, to make allowances for any other responses than carbon pricing to emissions reduction. And this would, of course, include Australia's technology-driven approach. So, as I said, we are talking to the EU and working with partners at the WTO and other forum, to think about how Cbam may impact and the sorts of things and concerns we may have. I'll just say we are also advocating for policies that promote trade, investment and development of technologies that directly address climate change. We see these as a more pragmatic approach to emissions reduction. We are looking for policies that are trade promoting rather than trade distorting, and incentivize rather than penalize relevant trade in goods, services and technology. And just noting the time, I'd be happy to sort of give a bit more detail in the panel discussion on some of those alternative approaches that the Australian government is pursuing. Thanks, Arnold.
Thank you, Jeremy. In light of the time, let's proceed immediately to our Q&A panel discussion. Panelists, as a reminder, please keep your responses concise in order to accommodate as many questions as possible. We do have limited time. My first question actually is to Nicholas. Nicholas, the EU emissions trading scheme entered into force way back in 2005, yet Cbam will not be fully implemented until 2026. How might you explain the time lag or the gap?
Yes, as I stressed, the carbon market scheme has been established in 2003. It entered into force in 2005. It has been amended significantly a number of times. And so it's doing by learning. It has been a long process. And in 2013, the lawmaker in Brussels, Strasbourg, struck a balance between, on the one hand, free allocations or grandfathering of allowances, and on the other hand, auctioning. And auctioning appears to be today the main rule, on the account that it brings money to the state authorities, and it gives a clear price signal. And auctioning is going to supersede free allocation. So, and that requires a progressive phasing in of auctioning and phasing out of free allowances. And that explains the progressive implementation from 2026 of the Cbam. So Cbam must be understood, must be seen as an alternative, as a complementary instrument to the carbon market scheme. What matters is also the price. So the fact of giving up free allocation or grandfathering in favor of auctioning will require the European operators to pay somewhat 7 billion euros. So the burden, the brunt of the burden will be borne by the European operators. Foreign operators exporting their products into the EU, according to the studies of the European Commission, will pay not 7 billion, but 2 billion. So one again looks at the number.
Thank you. Ivana, international trade law does not favor unilateral measures, rather it has a preference for a multilateral approach. So does Cbam counter this convention, and won't it be better to negotiate an international agreement on carbon trading rather than to develop a regional regulatory approach that may jeopardize free trade?
Thanks, Arnold. Of course, multilateral approach is always the best, but there are political obstacles to that. And given the nature of climate policy being global, carbon pricing should be best decided at international level. However, given the different regulatory approaches that countries have, of course, this is rather difficult. So on the one hand, you have countries being on different stages of their development, and even when the countries share the same objectives in terms of addressing climate change, their regulatory approaches are different. So from more market-driven or bottom-up approaches to more top-down approach, where the incentive for change is basically set through government policy targets. So for the EU, in order to achieve its own targets, it will be important to, and alongside what Nicholas has mentioned, to phase out free allocations and introduce Cbam as a complementary measure. And of course, Australia may be being in that first category of market-driven measures, would be maybe more interested to see what would be regulatory approaches in the US. Thanks.
Thank you, Ivana. Scott, it's one of the questions that we received ahead of the webinar. A number of countries and individual businesses are looking at their own ways to reduce their carbon emissions. If they are able to take account of their environmentally friendly efforts, could they offset Cbam related costs?
Yeah, okay, that's a very good question. Well, I guess in a way that speaks to one of the points that in fact Jeremy raised. So if companies can find ways to reduce the embedded emissions in their products, and this could be through technological advancements, then of course that will reduce the obligations under Cbam. So just in regards to offsets per se, I just wanted to mention a brief point about that as well, because we have sort of faced that question. It's not quite what you asked there, but as many of the speakers have mentioned, there will be more to come in the form of delegated acts and implementing acts in respect to Cbam. But I can't personally see a scenario where say, for example, a producer has purchased offsets from a country, within a country, and to completely offset the embedded carbon in that shipment. I can't see a scenario when they will be able to consider that to have completely reduced to zero their obligations in respect to Cbam, if you see what I'm saying. So another word about offsets just in general. They are a useful tool in the toolbox and as far as reducing emissions go, and they can provide a useful means of funding emission reduction projects, but we can't offset our way out of climate change. They have their limitations, and there are very important considerations in respect to things like permanence and additionality. Thank you.
Thank you. I will have another question if we have time, Scott, so I'll come back to you. Lily, what are some of the things we can do now to be ready for potential Cbam impacts on agriculture, or I guess any other mechanism that might be put in place by other jurisdictions?
Definitely, some of the things we can do right now is more effective baselining and monitoring of our emissions and how we sequester carbon. As Scott mentioned, we can't offset our way, but if we don't know where we're at, we can't respond to things. Agriculture is definitely in that position where some industries know what baselines they're working off, others have no clue whatsoever, and linked with that are inconsistency in methods. We need to be acknowledging that the methods by which we actually measure our emissions may vary, and we need to make sure that we are aware of what the standards are, what the accepted standards are, and what we need to work through. It's really quite important to also think that the carbon farming sort of initiatives that we go through will also need their own monitoring and effective baselining and benchmarking.
Thank you, Lily. Demis, my question is along similar lines. And I think in one sense you've partly touched on it already, but what is, can you expand a little bit more perhaps in terms of what the mining industry might be doing to mitigate any risk from Cbam type measures?
I think it's worth noting that they're not doing it to mitigate the risks of Cbam type measures. I think it's that they are looking at the importance of a shift to address the climate change risks, the importance of technologies in delivering those solutions, and actively working to either adopt those technologies or, where they don't exist, work with customers and partners in their supply chain to develop those technologies. And I point to two recent things that are worth highlighting here. The first is Japan's ambassador to Australia speech at a press club where he focused really strongly on the importance of strategic alliances between governments that underpin the development of technologies that we need. And he flagged the huge amount of investment, the co-investment that has gone into those technologies that are required to address challenges such as the ones we face around climate change. I think the other thing that I would point to is the point that Grant King made, where Grant King, of course, is the chair of the Climate Change Authority in Australia. And he, in early June, noted that we can't wait for a technology breakthrough or necessarily policy implementation, that we needed to start reducing emissions now. And we needed to also work towards technology solutions, but not simply put in place policy mechanisms in the hope that technology solutions would occur. Now, I was reminded of this when I thought about when Cbam and other Cbam type policies might be implemented, and was also reminded that the industry, the mining industry, has already been working very hard and has been implementing technologies to actually do the job of reducing emissions in their operations. The question in my mind is one of how can we continue to support the emergence of those technologies and continue to adopt renewable energy and other mechanisms to increase efficient operations, while still ensuring that Cbams and other policies out there can take account of, if you like, broader policy mechanisms and take account of what those industries are doing without adding cost and burden in the trade and supply chain.
Thanks, Demas. Jeremy, you raised some concerns over Cbam, and you did mention that there might be a potential alternative trade policy approaches that might actually be available to support emission reductions. Emissions. So can you expand a little bit on that?
Sure, thanks, Arnold. And I've been trying to keep an eye on some of the other questions that are coming in, so I'll try and hit those too whilst I've got the floor.
Excellent.
I mean, I think the point that I'd like to make, including in response to some questions, is that this is not so much a question about objective in terms of objective of the policies or various policies, but the best way to get there. And so for us, and it's a particularly important issue in the trade policy space, is about doing so in the least trade restrictive way possible, or in a way that's as least discriminatory as possible, or not discriminatory at all. So some of the things that we are doing and we are looking at, I think an earlier speaker, and I can't remember who, I apologise, mentioned, I think it might have been Ivana, the work on environmental goods and services. So Australia is driving work in terms of trying to liberalise trade in environmental goods and services. This includes working with New Zealand as APEC chair this year, but also in the WTO. From our perspective, reducing tariffs and addressing non-tariff barriers will incentivise the development and adoption of new technologies to address environmental challenges. It will lower the cost of these goods, improve trade flows, and support participation of developing countries in global supply chains in these goods and services. As people would be aware, we're also involved in discussions with international partners on how we can chart global net zero pathways through low emissions technology partnerships in areas such as hydrogen, reflecting the sort of technology, not taxes approach of the Australian government. I think the third example that I would just cite, and people may be aware, Australian and Singaporean ministers recently agreed to establish a working group to facilitate scoping discussions on a bilateral green economy agreement with a view to launching formal negotiations in this year. From our perspective, a green economy agreement could potentially facilitate trade and investment in environmental goods and services, strengthen environmental governance, and contribute efforts to build global capacity to address climate change. So methods to achieve the goal, but in a way that is less trade distortive. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Look, I might just push the clock a little bit, but we have a question here from Carolyn Foster, and I might direct it to both, to Nicholas as well as Scott, where she sort of asked, could panelists tell us more about which GATT rules the EU is relying on? Is WTO legality clear-cut, or does it rely on the precautionary principle? So maybe, Nicholas, you might be able to say something about that first.
Yes, I would like to remind that Ivana Damjanovic and myself, we shall take 40 minutes in explaining the legal obligations stemming from the forthcoming regulations. And in so doing, we shall address the compatibility with Article 2 and 3 of the 1994 GATT. So this is extremely technical issues, and I propose that we discuss the matter at the end of our speech, because it's going to take us some time to explain the differences within paragraph 2 of Article 3, the difference with paragraph 3 of Article 3. If you agree with this.
Scott, do you have any final words on that one?
Yeah, well, I'll leave the more technical legal discussions for later on. But I guess in terms of the WTO compatibility issue, I mean, listen, it's been flagged right from the very beginning in terms of the first mention of this in the European Green Deal. As I said, the European Parliament, when it issued a resolution in March, explicitly said this needs to be a WTO compatible measure. Similarly, the European Council in their council conclusions insisted that this be a WTO compatible measure. If you look at the actual measure itself, the documentation that's come out so far, it's absolutely peppered with innumerable references to WTO compatibility. I take it, obviously, the devil is in the detail, but as I said, really it's aimed at being a non-discriminatory measure to combat carbon leakage. It's putting European Union producers that will be facing a carbon price on a level playing field with other international players.
Great. Thank you all. This is all the time we have left for the panel discussion for this first half of the webinar, at least. While some of the questions submitted by the audience may not have been picked up in this part of the discussion, I'm confident will be covered in the next segment of our webinar, which is in the next few minutes. For this segment, may I take this opportunity to express our appreciation to all of our speakers and to the partners of the Export Council of Australia, the ANU Centre for European Studies, the University of Canberra Centre for Change Governance, Université Saint-Louis Bruxelles, and with support of the Erasmus Plus program, the European Union. To our audience, thank you for joining us. If you wish to reach out to any of our speakers, their emails are on the closing slide. Hopefully that is up and running. We will now take a short break and return for the second segment of the webinar, which is at 4:15 today, which will delve more deeply into the issues. It will be quite interesting once you get some of our various experts to debate some of the points in a far more rigorous context. Thank you so very, very much.
Welcome back, everyone, to the second part of the Climate Change and International Trade Europeans' Approach to the Cbam Mechanism webinar. Can I just check that everyone can hear me okay? Excellent. All right, without further ado, I think we should kick off part two of the webinar, which is entitled the Legal and Policy Dialogue section. And this, of course, is broken up into two separate discussions, the first of which will occur from 4:15 to 5:30 p.m. Australian time, new trade policy mechanisms. And the second, after a short break, which goes from 5:35 through to 7 p.m. Australian time, climate change, justice, and concluding remarks. So if we just, before we turn now to the first section in part two, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, and to acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. So I'm absolutely delighted to present and act as moderator for this part two, the more detailed, content heavy, I guess, section of the webinar. And for those of you who have stayed with us from the first presentation, I'm sure you agree it was highly fascinating, interesting and topical material that was covered. For those of you who have just joined us, welcome. I'll just give some short introductions, and I'm aware that some of you may have already been introduced, but for the benefit of those who've just joined us this afternoon. In this first section, we have two wonderful speakers, Ivana Damjanovic and Nicholas de Sadalia. Ivana is a very well-rounded individual who comes from an EU background, where she was originally a diplomat within the Croatian Foreign Ministry. She's worked with the EU delegation. She's worked on investment law, international investment trade. She researches EU governance, external relations, investment governance. She did a PhD at the ANU through the Centre for European Studies. And so she's highly credentialed in this area. And she'll be joined by Nicholas, who is an eminent international academic specialising in EU law, environmental law, particularly international as well as domestic, and comparative law. He's an active commentator on EU legal and political issues, particularly in the areas of trade, investment, and sustainable development. I won't give you all these details because they're probably too long to list, but I will note that he's currently the, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, the Jean Monnet Chair on a right to a clean environment at the St. Louis University in Brussels. So welcome to both Ivana and Nicholas. So as I mentioned, this first part of part two, this first session, will explore in greater detail the European Union's proposal for a Cbam, and we'll get into the guts of its structure and operation. Given the objectives for the Cbam to complement the EU's emissions trading scheme that operates within the EU, this session will examine Cbam's compatibility with emissions trading schemes. And the final part of the presentation will focus on an examination of Cbam's compatibility with international trade law in particular. So I'll note that Ivana and Nicholas are going to be presenting together. We anticipate that'll be about a 40-minute presentation, and then we'll open up to some commentary and questions. As I understand it, the Q&A session will be open for people to place questions that we'll keep an eye on, and we'll do our best to address those. So can I now invite Nicholas and Ivana to proceed with their presentation?
Thank you, Darren, and I'll just share my screen. All right, thanks for this lovely introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. So Nicholas and I are going to talk about in more detail about the carbon border adjustment mechanism and its compatibility with the EU's own mechanism, internal mechanism, emissions trading scheme, and international trade law. So there were a number of questions that have been posed about Cbam. So is it a tax or is it a charge? Is it a regulation? Is it a competitiveness measure or an environmental measure? And is it a protectionist measure? Well, in order to address all these questions, we have summed up our discussion into two questions that we're going to look at this session. So how does Cbam complement the EU's emissions trading scheme, and does it comply with international trade law? So firstly, we're going to look at the design of the EU's emission trading scheme. Then we're going to look at carbon leakage as the element that links EU's ETS with Cbam. And then finally, we're going to look at Cbam in the context of international trade law. So if you look at the European Commission's website, you will see that the EU ETS is coined as the cornerstone of the EU policy to fight climate change. And indeed, it's a first such system for trading emission allowances in the world. Its main objective is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with obligations, international obligations under international treaties of the European Union as well as its member states. But ETS looks to pursue a number of sub-objectives which are economic in their nature. So it looks to be economically efficient. It looks to achieve integrity within the internal market and to be a competitive measure. So how does ETS work? So there is a link between the EU and the member states, of course. The European Union gives to member states authorities a number of allowances, and allowances basically a permission to emit 1 ton of CO2. Member states member states are giving to fixed installations in the member states permits. So these fixed installations entitle energy intensive industries covered by the ETS. Mainly this would be power generators, steel companies, cement companies, to emit 1 ton of CO2. So, and these installations have the obligation to surrender the allowances at the end of the year, which should equal the total emissions that these installations emitted during the calendar year in the production of their products. And allowances are valid for a year, and they are surrendered, as mentioned, to the national authorities. Importantly, this is a cap and trade system. So it puts a cap on overall carbon emissions. It lowers that cap over time and sells the right to emit carbon at an increasing price. If the company reduces its emissions, it can actually sell spare allowances to other companies and earn some money. And at the moment, the price of allowances has skyrocketed. Or it can keep the spare allowances for the future need. And basically the ETS reduces the number of emissions allowances over time, which in turn, of course, drives up the price of the allowances and provides an incentive to adopt cleaner production techniques. The main way of attributing these allowances is through auctioning. That is the default method. And a number of allowances are given for free with a view to address carbon leakage. So they're given for free in those sectors which are at most risk of carbon leakage. So there are certain key issues with respect to ETS, and I give over to Nicholas now.
Yes. The ETS revolves around 2 key concepts: permits on the one hand and allowance on the other hand. These 2 concepts must be seen against a global background, a cap and trade scheme that has been in force since 2005. So to cut a long story short, the idea is that the scope of the directive covers plants, today 14,000 plants, that are emitting a significant number of greenhouse gases. The operators of these plants or installations are called on or are required to obtain a license, a permit, in order to emit greenhouse gases. This license is granted by the national or the regional authorities. The license includes the obligation to surrender at the end of the year the allowances corresponding to the installation's total emissions. So it means that, let's take the case of a cement kiln or steel mill that emits 55,000 tons of greenhouse gases. The operator of that plant is required to surrender to its national authority, the Slovakian or the Irish authority, 55,000 allowances corresponding to the emissions that took place in the course of the production process through the year. And of importance is to avoid any fraud. The operator is obliged to forward a report describing the manner in which the plant has been operated. And this report is subject to verification. And we will come back to the issue of verifications in discussing Cbam. Second is the issue of allowances. Allowances amounts to, is the equivalent of 1 ton of CO2. So I come back to my previous examples, 55,000 tons of CO2 being emitted equal 55 tons of allowance that must be purchased. The allowances won't last more than a year. They're just valid for a certain period of time. So they are either, as Ivana stressed, allocated or granted for free, and they must be surrendered to the national authorities to cover the emission for that year. So at the end of the year 2021, the 14,000 operators will be obliged to surrender to the 27 national authorities the amount of allowances that correspond to the emissions. The national authorities are obliged to cancel the allowances. So the market is taking place in the course of the year, from January to December. When the allowances are surrendered to the national authorities, they are cancelled. They don't exist anymore legally. So the operators either surrender a number of allowances equaling their total emissions, the operation is neutral. So they take part in the auction in January, they purchase 55,000, they emit 55,000 tons of greenhouse gases, the operation is neutral. In case they emit more greenhouse gas because their business is successful, they will have to purchase from other operators allowances. And this allowance might be more expensive. Or in case they have to, for the pandemics, to reduce their activities, they will find themselves with extra allowance that they can place on the market or that they can keep for a certain time. And so I come to the third issue, which is cap and trade. So this scheme has been leading to the creation, as Ivana has been stressing, to a true and the most ambitious cap and trade emission market on this planet. So what matters is the parsimonious allocation of allowances in order to oblige the operators in investing in new technologies with a view to diminishing then their greenhouse gas emissions. So how to achieve that is by reducing the cap. And so since 2013, the cap is global. It's not a 27 national cap or the addition of 27 caps. It's a one single cap that's being reduced by 1.74% a year. So it means that the 14,000 EU operators find themselves in having to purchase on the market diminishing amount of allowances. And that lead to the increase of the price. And what we are stressing now is of utmost importance to understand how Cbam is going to work, because Cbam price is related to the price that's derived from the interplay between supply and demand. So last, our allowances are allocated, and I will like to answer the question of Darren Sinclair. The allowances are either auctioned, and so that's the main rule today, or they are granted for free, conferred for free, in order to cope, to grapple with this carbon leakage risk. So the member states are granted under the scheme a certain number of allowances to be conferred for free or to be auctioned. What matters is to allow an Australian company to start to operate a plant in the harbour of Antwerp or Dunkirk. So 5% of the total number of allowances provided under the yearly cap is granted, is conferred to foreign operators moving. So the cap cannot be seen as an obstacle to the entry of new investors on the European markets. What matters also is the fairness of the scheme. To cut a long story short, 88% of the amount of the allowances is distributed to the state, the 27 member states, according to their historical emissions. But as you're aware, there is a discrepancy between the economic success of Western Europe and some Central European countries are somewhat laggard, economically speaking. 10% of the auctioning rights are divided between the member states of Central Europe because they have to carry out much more effort in order to purchase new technologies with a view to abating the emissions. So, so to speak, the system is constantly improving, and that we will come back to this issue with respect to Cbam, because Cbam won't be implemented per se in one day. It's going to be a 10 years process, as it has been stressed by Mr. Scott a while. At the outset, the system was highly decentralized, so the member states were deciding their own national emissions plans, being supervised by the European Commission, and that gave rise to a lot of wrangling between Brussels, the European Commission, and the national states that were far too generous in conferring many allowances for free to their friends operating their companies. And so that led to a further centralization that led to the cancellation of the national plans and to have one single EU cap that's constantly decreasing with a view to increasing the price. And so the price issue is the key factor. In case the price does not increase, the operators have no incentive whatsoever to purchase new technologies with a view to limiting their greenhouse gas emissions. Next, please. And so that's what's already been commenting. Free allocation created serious problem that has been discussed among lawyers, among economists, because it's running counter this pollute-based principle. So you get for free, you don't, the operators does not cover the externalities. It undermines this pricing mechanism. So the price had been far too low. They did not reflect the economic impact of these greenhouse gases. And in particular, they were depriving member states from much needed resource to carry out the shift, the energy shift, to give up coal production in order to be replaced by windmills or by hydropowers. And so no incentive. So auctioning is really phasing in, and that means that in the coming 10 years, the grandfathering or the conferral of allowance for free is going to fade away progressively. And that entails the entry into force of Cbam. So Cbam constantly interact between the phasing in, phasing out of auctioning and conferral of free allowance. I hope that we are clear enough on this point.
Sorry. Hence the need for a complementary mechanism, and the complementary nature of Cbam is enshrined in its objectives. So in the Article 1 of the Cbam regulation proposal, the main objective is to address greenhouse gas emissions which are embedded in the goods which are specified in the regulation upon their importation into the customs territory of the European Union in order to prevent the risk of carbon leakage. So the Cbam mechanism indeed complements the ETS, and it is designed to apply an equivalent set of rules, so the equivalent set of rules that are applied to the installations within the EU covered by the ETS. So those set of rules are to equally apply to imports to the EU of the same products. So progressively, Cbam is to become an alternative to free allocations, and those are to be phased out by 2035, as already emphasized. Of course, the there are other objectives of Cbam. So one of it is also to encourage third country producers to use cleaner technologies, because as we will see, the actual emissions are counted in, and to encourage also third countries to implement same or similar green policies, given that there is a possibility for the Commission to exempt certain countries from this mechanism. So how does Cbam work? So let's say we have a producer in a third country somewhere in the world, and we have an importer within the EU. And our importer wishes to import products which are covered by Cbam, so in sectors covered by Cbam, which are all listed in Annex 1 of the regulation. And our importer will have to request from a member state competent authority, these are the authorities which are assigned by the member states, an authorization to import. Once that authorization is given, our importer will become an authorized declarant and will be able to import a product into the EU. This product will, of course, be subject to regular customs procedures by customs authorities of the member states. And in addition, this product will have to have a Cbam declaration, which is specifying the quantity of products which are imported during the calendar year in tons or megawatts for electricity. The total embedded emissions, which have to be calculated according to the method which is specified in the regulation in Annex 3, or if they're not calculated, the default value applies, again specified in the regulation. And Cbam declaration will also outline any carbon costs which are already paid in the country of origin. The total embedded emissions will be, this is the information that the importer gets from the producer in the third country, but this information has to be verified by the authorized verifiers who are based in the EU, and they get authorization from the member states. So once these embedded emissions have been verified, the other methods of verification of embedded emissions is for the producers in third countries, operators themselves, requesting from the Commission to be included in a central database, and their registration then lasts for 5 years. But they basically then have to determine what are the total embedded emissions, and these emissions have to be verified in the same way as those that are declared on the declaration. So once the importer knows what are these embedded emissions, the importer will buy Cbam certificates from competent member state authorities. And the total number of Cbam certificates has to equal the embedded emissions, which were declared in the declaration, minus any carbon costs which have already been paid in the country of origin, and a reduction for any free allowances. Here, these allowances that are given to the installations in the EU for the production of same products come into place. So they're reduced and taken into account with respect to the number of certificates that the importer has to buy. Importer has also certain obligations, so it has to submit the Cbam declaration to the competent authorities and surrender the Cbam certificates as well for the products and emissions in the previous year. Any unused certificates can be resold, not any actually, a specified number of 1/3 up to 1/3 of unused certificates can be resold to the can be resold to the member state authorities. And the member states are the ones that are in charge of the enforcement and making sure that the declaration and certificates match. With respect to the price is determined at the central level by the Commission, and that price is linked to the ETS allowances. So the price is determined of certificates is determined weekly, but it is based on the average of the daily daily auction price for ETS allowances. Okay, so again, the number of key concepts and issues that we will explore into more detail. So first issue, what products and what type of emissions and from which countries are actually covered by the regulation? Nicholas.
Yes. As we've been discussing, the scheme is going to be implemented step by step, stage by stage. At the first stage, the European Commission proposes to cover but a few sectors, a few economic sectors, 5 so far. These sectors are characterized by the fact that the production process emits a significant number of CO2. So let's take the example of aluminium. Aluminium dioxide must be broken to become aluminium. In the course of that process, an average of 5 tons CO2 is emitted per ton of aluminium produced. That's done in Iceland or in Norway. If one looks at the aluminium process in China, the numbers of greenhouse gas is much more significant because the Chinese producers reach up to 20 tons of CO2 per ton of aluminium produce. Another case in point will be the cement industry. The cement industry is breaking calcium carbonate into calcium oxide, and in so doing, the process gives rise to emissions of CO2. The heat that's needed, that is required to break the calcium carbonate is amount to 1,300 degrees Celsius, and so produce a lot of energy. So the 5 sectors at stake are critical sectors, and so I imagine that the European Commission wants to put the pressure on the most energy intensive economic sectors. So of importance is to look at Annex 1 of the proposal that subdivide each sectors into a number of products, and the column on the right focuses on the different type of greenhouse gases that are encompasses. So at the first stage, the Commission is intent upon covering exclusively the direct emissions in the course of the production process of the goods, and they will examine the potentiality to cover indirect emission at a later stage. So regarding the geographical scope, one has to understand that the European Union has specific links with other European countries like Iceland or Norway or Switzerland. These countries already implement the greenhouse gas carbon scheme. And because they are already implementing the same rules than the 27 member states, they are excluded from the Cbam system. And so it means that whenever a third country will apply schemes that are somewhat similar or equivalent to the carbon market applied in the EU, the European Commission is likely to expand that list and to exclude it from the Cbam scheme. So as Ivana has been stressing, the objective of the lawmaker might also to encourage or to entice third countries to dash in building up a specific carbon scheme.
Okay, so that brings us to the next question of authorized declarant. So what are the obligations of the importer? Importers, as mentioned, are entitled to import Cbam goods covered by the Cbam regulation, only after they've been granted the authorization, which is granted by the competent member state authorities. And authorized declarant may represent more than one importer. There are a number of obligations. So what, as mentioned already, submitting annually a carbon Cbam declaration, which outlines the embedded emissions in the goods which are imported to the EU in that year, and surrounding a number of Cbam certificates which corresponds to that to those declared emissions. But at the end of each quarter, authorized declarant must hold certificates which are equivalent to 80% of the emissions embodied in imports. So there has to be certain calculation of how many they will need. And also they have an obligation to report. So as you see, a number of administrative obligations that authorized declarants have, but they also may claim a reduction in the number of certificates which they have to surrender. So, and that reduction can be claimed for the carbon price already paid for those emissions in the country of origin, in case that the country of origin has such mechanism. And the reduction can be claimed, importantly, for the imports of goods for which the EU still allocates free allocations to EU installations. And this is extremely important for achieving compatibility of the scheme with the international trade law, as we will see. Given that authorized declarants cannot trade with their certificates, unlike in the ETS scheme, they may resell excess certificates to member state competent authority, but basically the compliance costs fall on the authorized declarant. Nicholas?
Yes, so I would like to complement my colleagues' comments. So the foreign importers must really assess the time at which it's more opportunistic to purchase the certificates. And so there is really, that's where the tricky part is taking place. The price of the certificate is linked to the weekly price of the cap and trade scheme. And so this price does vary day by day, week by week, year by year. And so what matters, it seems to us, is to determine the appropriate week where the price is going to be very low to purchase the maximum certificates with a view to covering the embedded emissions of the steel or the cement on the aluminium that has to be reported to the national authority by April of the year afterwards. So it means that the operators will have to work to collaborate with economists in order to determine when the purchase should take place. And that's indeed a rather tricky part. So the importers will have to report the total greenhouse gas emissions embedded in their goods, be it steel, be it aluminium, be it cement, be it electricity, for the year 2026, 2027, 2028. And so here we can look at some analogies with the ETS scheme, the carbon market, is the data has to be verified by authorized companies, authorized by verifiers, authorized by the national authorities. And I imagine some of the companies that are already verifying the greenhouse gases emitted by the plants, the 14,000 plants operate in Europe, will do the same business in checking, in assessing whether the data of the exporters regarding the greenhouse gas emissions embedded in their products are correct. Next, please. So, and we will come back, the two of us, when discussing WTO law obligations. The Commission has been favoring the calculation of emissions according to the actual emissions embedded in the imported products. So the view of the Commission is to avoid a too flimsy approach, a too risky approach in determining an average of greenhouse gas for the steel being produced in South Korea, or the steel being produced in Japan, or the steel being produced by Chinese companies. That requires, of course, the monitoring by the producers and the exporters of the emissions of greenhouse gas taking place in Japan or in South Korea or in the Chinese plants. And so the responsibility falls on the importers. Of course, that method might not work for the absence of available data. And in that case, the Commission proposed to base the calculation upon default values, somewhat an average of the emissions of the greenhouse gas related by the steel companies in China, that being based upon the literature. And the idea to avoid any risk of discrimination, the Commission proposed to calculate the average emission intensity according to the 10% worst performing EU installation. And we will come back to Chinese steels and European steel later on, and you will see that even in focusing on the 10 worst students of the European class, it's still pretty good for Chinese steel companies, but we'll just come back later on to this issue. So yes, as already stressed, the idea is to avoid fraud. The carbon market scheme has been fraud with a number of VTA or tax fraud in the course of 2010. And so the Commission is aware that whenever there is money, there is a risk of frauding it. And so the idea is that the data has to be verified, has to be assessed by accredited verifiers according to the principles laid down under Annex 5. Next, please.
Okay, so there is a possibility for non-EU operators of an installation in a third country to actually request from the Commission to be registered with the central database. And in these cases, the operator is the one that is going to inform the Commission about the embedded emissions by the type of goods that are produced at the installation. And the regulation requires from them to provide sufficiently detailed records. And such data as well has to be verified by an authorized verifier. And of importance is that that information, the information in the central database, then can be used by authorized declarants when they're importing the goods produced in the installation registered in that central database when they import them to the European Union. So a few notes about the Cbam certificates. So as mentioned, they are sold by the competent authorities to the authorized declarants, so to the importers. and their price is calculated depending on the price of the ETS allowances. So given that the ETS allowances are auctioned daily, the options were either to use the daily value in determining the price of certificates or the annual value, and some compromise has been found in the weekly average, which is a more practical approach. So the price is obviously linked to the ETS, and the price is also, it is, if you like, in a way regulated. So the price does not depend on the sale of certificates, but on the sale of the allowances. So these certificates are surrounded by importers on imported products based on embedded emission intensity of the products, and they are surrendered in the year following the year of importation, and based on yearly trade import volumes, and Nicholas has already explained some of the implications of that. Because Cbam certificates cannot be traded, member state competent authorities can repurchase 1/3 of excess certificates at the original price which was paid, and the remainder is annulled by 30th of June of the same year.
So let's be down to earth. The key question is how to calculate the specific embedded emissions of a good such as a ton of cement that's produced in India. So according to the Annex 3rd of the proposal of a regulation, the calculation must be based upon the attributable emissions of the installations. Let's imagine that the cement kiln in India produce 70,000 tons of CO2 a year. And the amount of tons of cement has been up to 100,000. It gives us a ratio of 0.7 tons of CO2 for each ton of Indian cement being exported to the EU. So the question is how many Cbam certificates the cement producer who is exporting not the whole production, because part of it goes to the Indian market, but half of the production, 50,000 tons. So one has to multiply the 50,000 tons by the ratio of 0.7 tons of CO2. And as Ivana has been stressing, by the price of the certificate being purchased in that specific week. Could be the first week of January or the first week of February or the last week of March. And lately the price amount to 60 euros. So it means that for exporting 50,000 tons of cement from India to the EU, the the importers will have to purchase from the German authority or the Belgian authorities, where the cement will be disembarked, around 1,950,000 of certificates in order to cover the embedded emissions. And so the matter, I imagine some of the audience are going to come with a number of questions, whether the scheme is not going to disadvantage companies that have abroad that have not yet been investing in new technologies. Of course, that will be the case. I just come with this example of the steel mill. So the data coming from the French Ministry of Environment in Paris. The steel mill not using electrical appliance emit an average of 1.8 tons of CO2. So much more than the cement. Cement is at 0.7. So cement is less energy intensive than steel production. And the life cycle analysis done in Europe about Chinese steel mills, they export somewhat 5 million tons of steel a year to the EU. They emit an average of 4 tons of CO2 for each ton of steel being produced. So let's imagine if in 2026, the price of the allowance is not at 60 anymore because the cap is going to shrink, but it might be at 120, 150 euros. One has to multiply 4 tons by 150. So it means 600 euros of certificates to be purchased by the importers of the Chinese goods in order to access the European market. So of course, there will be a disadvantage, a competitive disadvantage coming from the fact that the Chinese companies are producing steel mostly in burning coal.
All right, so there are a number of divisions of obligations between the different authorities that are involved, between the member state and the level of the Commission. So at the member state level, obviously customs authorities are going to release goods for free circulation, and they're the ones that are informing the competent member state authority about the imported goods, so the declarant, the code of the product, the quantity, the country of origin, and so on. The competent authorities, actually the most burden falls on the competent authorities. So they're the ones that are authorizing the declarant to import. They are in charge of sale and repurchase of the certificates, the verification of declarations, and the accreditation of the verifiers. So checking that the declarations and verifications match, and the enforcement of the regulation. On the other hand, the Commission is going to be in charge of the registration of installations and the operators which are based in third countries. Of course, has a very important role of calculating the Cbam certificate price, but also supporting the member states in implementing the regulation.
Yes, and I would like to compliment Ivana. Once again, the EU does not amount to a federation or confederation, so we are very far away from the Canadian or the Australian federal model. This is fairly decentralized, so the EU institutions have very few agents and civil servants. So the whole system must reckon upon the national competence, be it the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Environment, and the custom authorities. Now we would like to emphasize that we are somewhat dealing with a coin, and the two sides are reflecting, mirroring each other, a bit like the Roman god Janus. The objectives are bold, ambitious, as it has been stressed by Mr. Scott Wyatt. It's achieving a diminution of 55% greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 against the 1990 background. So let's compare these numbers with the Australian Commonwealth numbers. It's a diminution by 26 to 28%, not against the 1999 background, but against the 2005 background. So the Australian Commonwealth approach is much less ambitious than the EU approach. The idea is progressively to combine the carbon market scheme with Cbam. So the sectors that Cbam is covered as a matter of products will progressively cover all the products being produced by the 250 economic sectors falling within Annex 1 of the 2003 directive. And so that's an answer to Mr. Jeremy Green questions is, where are we heading? The logic of the scheme is that Cbam should correspond to the scope of the carbon market scheme, because the rationale is to get rid of free allowances. Free allowance, simply speaking, don't work and have to be replaced by auctioning. So there are a number of considerations at stake in determining the scope. The scope is the relevance in terms of emissions. So the first stage is to cover cement, aluminium, nitrates, and electricity, very intensive, energy-intensive sectors. And the idea is that these sectors are relatively homogeneous as a matter of products when there is a risk of carbon leakage. Also, the scheme is going to be difficult to implement. It, as Ivana just has been stressing in commenting the previous slides, it will require a lot of administration surveillance. And so the idea is also to strike a balance between what can be done technically speaking and what can be done from an administrative point of view. And so it means that, again, one should bear in mind that it's phasing in goes hand in hand with phasing out, and we are dealing with two sides of the same coin.
Yes, two sides of the same coin, but not completely the same. So here you can see the comparison between the two mechanisms and how it is similar, or in this case, different. So on the one hand, ETS has been regulated through a directive, and that is a legal mechanism in the EU which allows the member states to implement directives, so implement to achieve the same objectives through domestic regulation. With respect to regulation, the regulation is applied directly, so there is no implementation, no implementing act on the side of the member states. ETS works as a cap and trade scheme. Cbam does not have a cap, because that would mean a quantitative limit on imports, which would not be allowed under WTO rules. So no such cap for Cbam. In ETS, we're talking about installations which are based in the EU. Cbam, on the other hand, looks at products which are imported in the EU, but products which are the same products as those products produced at the EU installations. ETS introduces permits and allowances. Cbam talks about declaration and certificates. And the importance there in pricing is also relevant. So as we said, ETS works on the supply and demand dynamics through daily auctioning, and allows for trading of allowances. In that sense, it is more flexible. Cbam prices are determined on a weekly basis, and they mirror the pricing trend of the ETS allowances, the average, the weekly average. But because they cannot be traded, the excess can be resold to the competent authorities.
If I may complement, what really matters to us is this distinction between installations and products. So the 2003 carbon market scheme is inspired by the American sulfur models that was placed under the Reagan administration. And so that's related to installation, to fixed installation. Later on, they've been encompassing aviation, but we don't discuss aviations. It's impossible to encompass through Cbam installations in Bangladesh, in India, or in South Korea, or in Australia. So one has to deal with products because the carbon leakage scheme that's leading to the conferral of free allocation is to avoid that foreign products are far too competitive on the European markets. It's to avoid that risk of that type of situation. And so the complexity with respect to WTO comes from the differentiation between, on the one hand, installations, fixed installation, and on the other hand, corresponding products of the products being produced in the 14,000 installation based within the 27 member states.
Okay, and where to from here? Well, it's important to mention, and that has been already said in the first part, we are only at the stage of the Commission's proposal. So there is a legislative procedure, and the proposal will be discussed by the member states in the Council, and it has to be also approved by the European Parliament. So there is still a long way to go before the final legislative act is adopted. Then once it is adopted, there is an envisaged transitional period of 3 years during which the focus is, or the objectives are, to collect data, and declarants will be required to report on the actual embedded emissions, and generally to raise awareness so that the roll-in of Cbam regulation can go more smoothly. So the full application should be from 2026, with that gradual phasing out of ETS allowances as mentioned. So what are the next phases? They will really depend on the Commission's evaluation, but as mentioned by Nicholas, it is possible that they will expand to a broader range of sectors and possibly to achieve the full compliance with the ETS. And as well, there is a possibility to include indirect emissions as well, so Scope 2 emissions. Okay, and finally, a few words about Cbam and international trade law, and I'm conscious of time, and my clock has reminded everyone as well of the time. So very briefly, I think, Nicholas, 5 minutes?
Yes, I can be short. I can cut a long story short.
Okay, excellent. So what is important to say, Cbam is a long way from being adopted and implemented. So the legal analysis at this stage is really preliminary and provisional. And as one of the speakers in the first part mentioned, precisely how Cbam will be applied to an individual traded product in a particular factual circumstances cannot be foreseen at this stage. But what we can do is to assess to what extent the design of the measure is compatible with the WTO law. So in order to be compatible with WTO law, Cbam must comply with the core WTO principles. So most favored nation principle, it cannot discriminate between and among like imported products originating in different WTO member countries based on their carbon content. It has to comply with the national treatment principle, so imports cannot be afforded less favorable treatment than domestic EU production, and Cbam also cannot apply higher charges on imported goods than the agreed custom duty ceiling in WTO agreements. In case that Cbam does not comply with one of these principles, then one of the exceptions must apply. So this is really a fallback position. It has to be demonstrated that it is necessary to protect human health, and that is related to the prevention and of the exhaustion of natural resources under GATT Article 20.
Yeah, perhaps we don't really have to explain the fallback position, because the two of us are of the view that there is consistency with the key WTO obligations. So the subject matter is extremely complex, so I will cut a very long story very short. So the matter is whether it's a charge or a regulation, because Article 3, which reflect the principles of national treatment, encompass regulations on the one hand and tax or charge on the other hand, and the obligations differ. And so the Commission has been arguing that this amounts to a regulations. However, the two of us are not really convinced, because Article 3.4 that relates to regulations refers only to live products. And as we just been stressing, on the one hand, installations, 14,000, and on the other hand, millions of products. So we compare apples and pears. Next, please. So then the question is, is that a charge? So it seems to us that purchasing a certificate today in 2026 at 150 euros, and a certificate amount to 1 ton of CO2 being emitted, it's a fiscal pressure upon the operator. So what matters under the first sentence of Article 3.2 is that these charges should be identical to the charge being placed upon the operators operating in Europe, to avoid any charges in excess. And so that we can come back to these issues in answering some of the questions from the audience. So really what matters under the first sentence is, with respect to light products, to avoid any charge in excess. But again, we are not facing light products, and that's why we are moving to the second sentence of Article 3.2, which actually covers competitive and substitutable domestic and imported products. So it occurs to the two of us that we are closer to the second sentence hypothesis. And according to the different panels of the GATT, the states have the right to apply different rates. And that could be the case under Cbam and under ETS, in as much as there is no protectionism. And so the question is whether there is protectionism or not. And the thesis of Ivana and myself is that it might be not the case, because the carbon price is calculated upon the real emissions. Default values come as a default. Default values will be applied when emissions data are deficient. And in a worst case scenario, if the default value applies, if the average is actually not really reflecting the amount of emissions that took place that year in South Korea, the operators, foreign operators, has always the possibility to bring a request to the European Commission and to explain, well, sir, I've been emitting less than the EU average, and on that basis, I have to pay a lower price. So the system could avoid. So in this screen, we've been differentiating the two sentences of Article 3.2. And for the two of us, the main difficulties is light products. We are not facing light products, and the second sentence is more likely to apply. Next sentence, next slide, please. In addition, one could also invoke Article 2.2 that relates to tax border adjustment. Here we are facing a charge, not really a tax. And it seems to us that the charge subject to Article 3.2 can be imposed at the border under the second article with respect to foreign imports. But again, the system is not yet into force. We are dealing with a proposal. It might take years before the whole scheme enters into force. So we won't expect any risk of litigation before 2007, 2008.
Okay, and I won't go into the Article 20, but what is important to emphasize that in any case, the measure cannot be arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination, lead to arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination. So basically, there cannot be, the discrimination has to be based on very objective criteria and cannot be willingness on the side of the EU to discriminate between the products. And with respect, the measure cannot be also disguised restriction on international trade, and in this sense, it is important to properly offset free ETS allowances, which the regulation aims to do. So just to briefly conclude, when we talk about Cbam, a few things to bear in mind: the ambition. So the EU has very ambitious 2030 and 2050 targets. In order to achieve them, it's important to phase out the ETS free allocations. With this comes the risk of carbon leakage, and Cbam is there to ensure the consistency. It's complementary to ETS. So phasing out of ETS goes hand in hand with phasing in of Cbam, which is seen as its alternative. Pricing is an important element. So the EU cap is shrinking by 1.78% per year. So that means that the price of ETS allowances will increase because the demand for them will rise, and the price of Cbam certificate will also then increase because it is linked to the ETS allowances price. And finally, inasmuch as Cbam is embedded, that embeds emissions pricing, mirrors the charges which are paid by the EU operators to produce similar products in their installations, there is no de jure and de facto discrimination, and therefore no breach of GATT agreement. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas and Ivana, for that very comprehensive and detailed joint presentation. I hope the rest of our audience found it as fascinating as I did. I'm very, very conscious of time. I've written 2 pages of notes, which I won't be able to go through, but perhaps I can just highlight a few issues that came to mind, and then invite it open to the panel and Ivana and just Nicholas to respond to any other questions. Can I just indulge myself with a little historical detour, because I actually began my career working on the Framework Climate Change Convention in the early 1990s, and my main role was to actually negotiate something called joint implementation, which is essentially a form of offsets between international countries at the time. And many of those issues, and so I should say that was seen as a precursor to an international trading scheme on carbon. Many of those issues we encountered at that time, I'm not sure if I'm pleased or not pleased to realise that they're popping up, and they're exactly the same issues that are being dealt with now through the EU ETS and the Cbam mechanism. And that's around things like embodied energy and verification and pricing of the traded goods. So with that introduction, and to realise that it's taken 30 years to get to this point, perhaps it's better late than never. So some of the issues that I think that others might be interested in, verification of verified authorisers. It wasn't clear to me, Nicholas and Ivana, whether they would exist within other countries or they would go around from the EU and approve other countries. So that was one issue that I thought might be of interest of Australia. Another issue was whether developing countries that don't have an approved carbon price and therefore are subject to Cbam, whether all those countries, whether they are developing countries or developed countries, whether they would be treated equally under the Cbam mechanism. And that brings into potential tensions between social justice and environmental issues. I think there's an inherent potential tension also between the Cbam, which is linked to an ETS, and another country having a carbon tax. And you touched on this issue because, of course, the price of carbon under an ETS is variable, whereas under a tax, it is fixed. So therefore, you'd be comparing a fixed price versus a variable price, and how that would be accommodated under a Cbam mechanism is very far from clear to me. There's the issue of offsets, whether a company being recognised as correctly accounting for its embodied energy, whether it would be able to include offsets within its own operations as opposed to offsets from other sources. So if it was a site that had multi-sites, across different jurisdictions and so on, could it offset internally different operations to get a combined embodied energy price? I note here that Scott, I think from the EU, mentions that he wasn't keen on offsets. I find that comment intriguing, given that the ETS in itself is essentially a system of offsets. The key point is that it has a cap. So I think, Scott, your point really is that you don't want offsets without a cap, but that raises the questions if a country had a national target or an industry sector target and it had offsets, would they count under a Cbam mechanism, even though they weren't necessarily traded? I might leave it at there. Oh, one more question was expansion of the Cbam to cover other sectors and other gases, for example, methane, whether that's something that's contemplated in the future. And that obviously has implications for agriculture. I'll stop there, open up to the panel and Nicholas and any other questions from the floor. I think there's a Q&A box. Nicholas and Ivana, over to you.
Do you wish to begin, Ivana, and then I continue? Up to you.
I think you're on mute, Ivana.
Sorry, I said that Nicholas, you're welcome to start.
All right. Yes. So far, the Commission proposals with respect to the accredited verifier refers to previous regulations according to which the member states designate their own verifiers. So the importers of the goods, and we discussed that still yesterday between Canberra and Europe, will be accredited by the 27 member states. So there are already a lot of companies doing life cycle analysis, be it in Norway, be it in the Netherlands, be it in Belgium, that will embark upon that new market. One can imagine that in concluding bilateral agreement between the EU and the third member states, there might be provisions in that agreement providing for the recognition of verifiers. And I know that the EU is negotiating a bilateral agreement, a trade agreement with Australia. So that could be a venue to address, to acknowledge the competence of Australian verifiers. Regarding social justice, of course, the carbon price will hit to a greater extent export of products from developing countries. The memoranda of the European Commission stress that they want to avoid such a situation. And the explanation a bit, how does one say that in new language? It's a bit disappointing. There is no clear analysis so far. I think a cement might be a problem more than steel, because cement can be produced quite cheaply in Bangladesh and in India. So I didn't check the trade flow between these countries and Europe. And so there might be a higher charge. So that can be addressed again in bilateral negotiations with the diminutions of the tariffs imposed at custom levels. So there might be a compensation that will be envisioned by DG Trade. Very good questions regarding carbon tax, how to accommodate a tax is fixed. Here, one is dealing constantly with prices that do evolve according to the shrinking of the caps, according to the diminution of the number of allowances. That leads constantly to an increase of the price. I will remind the audience that in the course of the pandemics, the price fall to 15 euros a ton of CO2 being emitted. Today it's at 60 euros, and one can really expect a sharp increase of the price with the phasing out of the carbon leakage system. So how to accommodate this? I'm a bit at odds. I don't know whether you have any idea, Ivana, regarding this question. So that has to be, again, that will be the duty of the European Commission. So the regulation has to be adopted by the lawmaker. At the EU level, the lawmaker is on the one hand, the 27 ministers, and on the other hand, the 751 MPs. And so they will actually adopt the final act. However, the Commission will be granted significant powers in implementing and also delegated powers. So the Commission will be empowered to negotiate with the states with a view to reducing the carbon price according to the efforts carried out by the state abroad. And these efforts can be carried out through tax schemes, as you have been stressing, or they can be also carried out by specific sectoral carbon schemes. And these carbon schemes already exist, be it in California, be it in Massachusetts, be it in some part of China. So again, the system is likely to be very complicated because it will require a lot of negotiation with third countries, and that we discussed, Ivana and myself, yesterday. These negotiations are indispensable in order to avoid any de facto discrimination. So what matters is no violation whatsoever of Article 3, the principle of national treatment, no discrimination. And in order to avoid discrimination, I think that there must be a two-pronged approach: bilateral negotiation, EU and the third states, and taking into account the claim of the company that's likely to fall under a specific average.
Nicholas, I might just step in there because we are really running out of time. I noticed Scott's got his hand up. Should we invite Scott and then perhaps Ivana to make some final comments? Go ahead, Scott.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, just a very, very quick comment. I'll leave some of the more detailed remarks to the other panelists. Obviously, you're going into great deal of detail, which is great. But just a couple of quick ones. I heard that there was a question about methane. So you may be aware methane's not actually covered in the EU ETS. So therefore, I can't see it being considered as to be part of Cbam. You're also asking about equity issues and developing countries, least developed countries. So the Cbam will not discriminate when it comes to developed and developing countries and least developed countries, but the European Commission will continue to provide technical assistance, technology transfer, and other kinds of assistance to those countries. And it's probably germane to point out that the EU is in fact the largest provider of climate finance, and that funds have substantially increased in recent years. Thanks.
Just very quickly, if I might just, and I'm not asking you to answer this now, but there is the question of what happens to the revenue raised by Cbam. I don't think that's been addressed anywhere, but that's an interesting point of discussion. But Ivana, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to compliment Nicholas on the issue of verifiers. So indeed, as he mentioned, and it is in the regulation, the Commission is empowered to adopt delegated acts in accordance with with the regulation in order to specify conditions for the control of and oversight of accredited verifiers, and also then look at for mutual recognition and so on. So that's an important part. With respect to social justice, there was actually a study done by UNCTAD, which was based on the resolution of the European Parliament in March. And it did some estimates in terms of the impact of Cbam on the reduction of global emissions, and it didn't come to a very important conclusions in terms of that Cbam is going to contribute to those emissions on a larger scale. And it has been noted that Cbam could result in declining of exports in developing countries in favor of developed countries. And of course, Scott has already addressed some of the issues there, how the EU might be looking at that. In terms of the budget, the funds are going to the EU budget. So they're linked to the new generation EU, next generation EU, the financial package. And Nicholas, you wanted to add something more?
Just quickly before you go, Nicholas, and there'll be the final comments. I just note there was a question by Mike Thompson, sorry. Nicholas, and if you could just quickly address that as part of your wrapping up, which was, given that the Cbam is not phasing out free allowances to 2035, is that ambitious enough to meet the COP26 ambitions?
That's a political question. No, but just on the budget, because that really matters. Under the carbon scheme, the member states got the money, and they have to dedicate 50% of the money to energy shift. Under Cbam, the money will be channeled, streamlined to the European Commission to repay the debt, the 750 billion debts regarding the pandemics, and most of the national plans being implemented in the aftermath of the crisis is about energy shift. It's about environmental transition. So on the two sides of the coin, the funds will be partly allocated to the climate crisis.
All right. Okay. Look, I think we might leave it there, and let's take a quick break and reconvene at 5:45. Have a quick stretch, run around, go to the bathroom, and we'll be back at 5:45. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to keep my opening remarks very brief, given that we've lost some time, so we've got to make up some time. Welcome to our next two speakers, Professor Murray Raff and Professor Benedict Sheehy, or I call him Ben. This second session is exploring the issues of climate change justice, and both in Australia and Europe, and how are the courts in particular in Australia and Europe addressing and influencing climate change policies through their decisions. And I'm sure anyone who's been following the news in the last little while will have noticed there have been several landmark decisions made in various jurisdictions in the courts around climate change issues, and in Australia as well, quite recently. So fascinating. Just very quickly, by way of introduction, Professor Murray Raff is an emeritus professor at the University of Canberra. He also holds various visiting fellow positions at various universities, and is an expert in environmental and property law, with a particular emphasis on international comparisons. Professor Ben Sheehy is also a professor of law at the University of Canberra, and is a leader in the field of corporate social responsibility and corporate law and regulatory theory. So with those very brief, and I apologise, but I'm not absolutely not doing them justice for their status, but I think it's in order of getting on with things. I'll hand it over to Murray. I think you're going first. And again, people, if you have questions, put them in the chat box or in the QA section, and we'll have a discussion at the conclusion of the two presentations. So over to you, Murray.
Thanks very much, Darren. So I've just been getting a cat out of the room. It was sure to jump up on the desk if he was left in here. So I apologise for the running backward and forward. Thanks very much for the invitation to present. I hope everyone can see those slides. Maybe I didn't share it properly.
Murray, we can't see them just at the moment. So
okay. Sorry, here we go.
All good.
Oh, great. So I'll just turn them on. Yes, thanks very much for the invitation to be involved in this. It's been a fascinating presentation, especially from Ivana, Nicholas, and the other presenters as well. It's a very interesting question. So my topic is, as you can see, climate change litigation in Australia and its impact on climate change policies. Before I start on the legal aspects, just a few points about the intersection of law, economics, trade, and the environment. Many of us will understand some of these points, introductory points already, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, the theory of law and economics, particularly with respect to environmental law, revolves very much around the concept of externalities, environmental externalities, and the internalisation of externalities. So just very briefly, an externality is a cost in production of goods that is borne by others, and so not reflected in the price of the good. And this distorts the market because producers who are unable to externalise costs do not compete on a level playing field with producers who can. So from an environmental point of view, an energy producer, for example, whose environmental costs, such as air pollution, are externalised to the environment, it appears to sell the energy at a cheaper price, but the true costs are being borne by the environment, neighbours and others who have to put up with the air pollution. On the other hand, an energy producer who produces no environmental costs would compete more favourably if the price of the polluter's energy actually accurately reflected the true cost of production. So that's relevant to our discussion. An energy producer who burns coal and produces carbon dioxide is contributing to climate change, whereas an energy producer with using renewable energy doesn't. Now we know now the way that solar energy technology has emerged, it's cheaper in any case, but if the coal burning energy producer had to bear the costs, environmental costs of climate change, which we know are mind-boggling and absolutely phenomenal and beyond the cost of the planet to afford, then it would not be able to compete at all with renewable energy. So there is a theory in economics and law that external costs like air pollution can be forced. We can force them to be internalised through legal liability and litigation. So, for example, one example would be that if a producer is misdescribing the environmental performance of their goods and thus is competing in a much more favourable way with a producer who has good environmentally functioning goods, but is describing them accurately, then you can sue the producer who is misdescribing their goods, and the legal system will force the polluter to internalise their costs, and their prices will be higher, or they won't sell as well on the market. So that's how law, from an economic perspective, law is supposed to operate in terms of environmental protection. Now, beside that ideal, really, that abstract idea, climate change litigation is not performing as well as we certainly hoped at earlier stages. Anyway, the main points I'm going to make in my paper around the way climate litigation is actually functioning. I mean, it does have many promising aspects to it, but in terms of compelling the internalisation of climate change externalities, there is still a long way to go. Anyway, climate litigation in Australia its main function has been to challenge inadequate environmental assessment and approval of projects that will emit greenhouse gases. And most of those cases have been probably the construction and extension of coal mines. There have been recent climate litigation successes in New South Wales. The New South Wales Court of Appeal handed down a decision just on Tuesday, which it is very promising. However, apart from these recent New South Wales successes, the success of climate litigation in Australia has been mixed at best. And a lot of this relates to the conservatism of common law systems generally. Just from a structural and interpretative perspective, they draw their juristic material from the past. And so when dealing with something unprecedented like climate change, there is a struggle to match old principles with the emerging situation. And we'll look at that briefly when we come to the recent Sharma decision with duty of care to future generations. Ideally, the climate change issue would be managed with political leadership and proactive law reform at the national level. However, that has not been the case in Australia. There has been a toxic politics of climate change, of climate and greenhouse for decades in Australia now that has really stalled national leadership on the issue. On the other side, in the Australian Federation, the states have generally been responsible for environmental protection, mining and electricity generation. There are also on that side concerns with a federal approach that if the national government took on climate change in a really robust way, there would be, to start with, a lack of depth and experience in federal government in the area, and it might not be as successful as we would hope. We might end up with the lowest common denominator approach, not the excellent, the excellent approach is not likely to prevail, and that's a serious concern with the coal mining is done mainly in Queensland and New South Wales. And so the New South Wales approach, for example, which is emerging as an excellent approach, could be drawn down by lower regulation in other states, or the Commonwealth in forming a national approach could take an approach that undermines, say, the New South Wales approach. Anyway, also, if the Commonwealth exercised power over greenhouse gas emissions, a Commonwealth approval of a particular project could override a state refusal to approve it. On the other side, states have not created strong climate regulation. if we look at the way that state environment protection authorities have regulated other gases like carbon monoxide, for example, there is nothing so robust as that in the Environment Protection Acts of, say, Victoria and New South Wales. And so the states themselves are not excelling in climate emissions, greenhouse gas emissions regulations. So in that kind of Australian mixture of issues, there is certainly a potential role for trade and international relations in preventing the distortion of markets that occurs when one energy producer doesn't have to internalise its environmental costs and other energy producers have to compete against that, against an operator or a sector that is effectively subsidised or free riding on the environment. Okay, well, in Australia, it's, you know, you might think that certainly it appears in the media that climate change is a recent idea, that we weren't aware of it or have all been asleep. But actually, since 1988, climate change has been an issue in national popular thinking. Before 1988, you could say that the idea of global warming was an issue that one knew about through reading New Scientist or specialist periodicals. But with the Greenhouse 88 conference held in Australia, I think we could say that it had often entered popular thinking at that point. And so Australia signed on to the Climate Change Convention at Rio de Janeiro. After that, the implementation of Climate Change Convention went all over the place with almost nothing happening during the Howard years. In fact, probably going backwards until 2007, when the Rudd government at that point was elected and attempted to set up a carbon trading scheme and other reforms. Again, the Liberal National Party government that has of Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison have all had different approaches to the global warming issue. At this point, as has been noted by other speakers, our targets under the Paris Agreement are modest compared with many other countries, with even the UK trying to persuade us to adopt more rigorous objectives. Nevertheless, despite that period of time that has passed, there has been no significant new issue in climate science since 1988. Perhaps acidification of the oceans could be something that was not thought about deeply in 1988, but has become apparent now. But mainly over that period, from a scientific perspective, it has been a question of refining measurement and modelling, but the issues are really very much the same. So we've spent a lot of time, and the legal system has spent a lot of time arriving at the place where we are at this point. Okay, well, environmental litigation usually follows two main approaches, and I've already mentioned one of those. One is to challenge in the courts inadequate environmental assessment and approval of projects that will emit greenhouse gases, and that has been mainly the construction and extension of coal mines. So this is the judicial review path in the courts. Second, the angle that has been taken is advocacy in land use planning and environmental discharge approval processes, and in the public hearings that are held with respect to large projects in those processes. And then often there are opportunities for merits review, and so legal advocacy has taken place in merits review as well, in order to advocate for alternative approaches with reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So these are not really, these are legal actions that seek to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, but they're not specifically directed to internalising carbon costs. The third category, which has emerged much more recently, is the possibility of suing an energy producer on the basis of civil law or private law liability. And this has been encouraged by the recent Australian Federal Court decision in Sharma, just in April of this year, where Justice Bromberg in the Australian Federal Court, in the case of Sharma, held that the Minister for the Environment had a duty of care to children of the future in a case that was initiated by 8 Australian children, Sharma. That direction also is reflected in the recent Dutch case against the Shell structure of companies which are based in the Netherlands, Royal Dutch Shell, and also some years ago now, it's probably 5 or 6 years ago, the German-Peruvian glacier case, which has not yet been concluded, where a litigant in Peru whose house was at risk through the collapse of a bank of a lake, which in turn was caused by the melting of a glacier. The lake was fed by this melting glacier and was threatening to inundate his house. So he sued a German energy producer for past greenhouse gas emissions and the destruction of the house. So this is a course of action that would compel the or has the potential to compel internalisation of externalities, because there would be a financial price to be paid to the people who suffer damage as a consequence of climate change. But of course, once that happens, it's all too late for all of us, isn't it? It's not, this is one of the problems with law, in particular with common law systems, that they are not forward-looking generally. So on the other hand, challenges to the approval of projects that will emit carbon are more effective from a practical point of view, so long as the legal system is dealing with them in a sensible way. So I've mentioned some of the recent environmental litigation just in that brief overview, but I'll just go through some of the most recent cases that we've seen in Australia. The first one, the Australasian Centre, I'm going backward through time, retrospectively. The Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility against Santos is a case that commenced just recently in the federal court against the oil and gas giant, alleging misleading and deceptive claims in its annual report about its carbon pollution credentials. So that case has not even really come on yet. It's just been initiated recently, just in past weeks, really. The KEPCO Bylong Australia case, KEPCO, the parent company, is a Korean energy company that wanted to set up a mine in New South Wales in the Bylong Valley with the objective of exporting from Australia the coal from its mine for use in its coal-fired power stations in Korea. The Independent Planning Commission of New South Wales declined approval of the new coal mine, and then partly on the basis of carbon emissions, but also groundwater and other water use, and the destruction of valuable farmland involved. The miner, KEPCO, sought judicial review of that decision, And the judge in the Land and Environment Court, in the Land and Environment Court, Justice Payne, upheld the initial decision to refuse the approval, and then the miner appealed that decision to the New South Wales Court of Appeal. So this is one step below the Australian High Court in the court hierarchy, and the New South Wales Court of Appeal unanimously dismissed that appeal. There were two judgments, two judges co-authored a judgment, and the second judgment was by the third judge, but they all agreed on most points. The third single judge was probably a bit more emphatic about some of the climate change aspects. That was Justice Preston, who was the Chief Justice of the Land and Environment Court, the very progressive judge in environmental issues. Okay, well, I mentioned before Sharma and the Minister for the Environment, and this judgment was handed down only a month or so ago, where 8 Australian children sought a declaration that when the Minister for the Environment decided whether to approve a coal mine expansion, the Minister owed the children a civil or private law duty of care with respect to the harm that will be caused to them in the future by global warming, particular health impacts of a warmer environment. The children also sought injunctions to restrain the Minister, whereas the judge, Justice Bromberg, was prepared to make declarations. He declined to issue the injunctions that would stop the Minister approving the new coal mine extension. This decision is on its way to appeal in the full federal court because the Minister for Environment disputes that she owes a duty of care to children in the future when deciding approvals of carbon projects. Another recent case just weeks ago was a decision of Chief Justice Preston sitting alone in the New South Wales Land and Environment Court, Bushfire Survivors for Climate Action against Environment Protection Authority. And Chief Justice Preston ordered that the New South Wales Environment Protection Authority has a duty to develop environmental quality objectives, guidelines and policies to ensure the protection of the environment from climate change, and issued an order to direct them to do that. So it might be that the more robust state environment protection methods, regulatory methods, such as the one that's used for gases like carbon monoxide, could be adopted in the course of that. We can only hope, I suppose. Finally, a decision that's not quite so recent as those others, but nevertheless still recent, if you're looking at a scale back to 1988, the Gloucester Resources decision, another decision of Chief Justice Preston sitting alone in the Land and Environment Court. In this case, the Minister for the Environment in New South Wales, it's a Liberal National Party coalition government. The Minister, Matt Keane, is a very progressive thinker in climate, certainly spokesperson in climate issues, and he declined approval of a coal mine expansion. The miner appealed against the Minister on a merits review, and Chief Justice Preston upheld the Minister's disapproval. And in handing down his judgment, Chief Justice Preston produced a textbook review of the risks of climate change and the way that the courts should approach carbon projects with respect to approval from a planning and environmental perspective. And that judgment, if it's adopted more widely, and the recent KEPCO Court of Appeal decision suggests that it could well be, because many of the issues dealt with by the Court of Appeal were not dealt with actively by the court, but were simply left to lie. They were not overturned or criticised in any way, which had been dealt with by Chief Justice Preston in this decision. So we've been sort of waiting for a decision like this that would indicate how the Court of Appeal is likely to regard Chief Justice Preston's judgment in this case, and it seems that it has been accepted by the Court of Appeal, which is a wonderful thing for progress in climate litigation. Those successes in recent weeks have been preceded by decades of paradoxical and baffling approaches by courts. And I've divided some of these issues into cases of judicial review on one side and merits review on the other. And what the review reveals, as well, particularly emphasised now with hindsight by the recent cases from New South Wales that are really leading lights in this situation, what it reveals is that there is a strong distinction between the New South Wales approach that's emerging and the Queensland approach that's emerged, or the Queensland approach that is becoming more entrenched as time goes on. Anyway, some of the paradoxical treatments by courts include the following. One of the issues that the courts have dealt with on judicial review has been whether Scope 3 carbon emissions should be considered as an environmental effect of a particular project. So I apply to, as a coal miner, apply to the New South Wales government for approval of my proposal to mine coal in the Hunter Valley. And the planning process then has an intellectual crisis about whether Scope 3 emissions are actually a product of my proposed coal mining project, or whether they are activities by third parties pursuing other activities which themselves should have some kind of planning approval. Of course, if the coal is to be exported, we have no control over the activities that involve burning the coal, in contrast to the activities that involve mining the coal. So the courts struggled for decades over this question of whether a Scope 3 emission is actually an environmental impact from a coal mining project. They accepted Scope 1 and readily came to terms with Scope 2 as well, but Scope 3 was really a hotly disputed issue until Chief Justice Preston's decision in Gloucester, and that was not criticised in any way in the recent Court of Appeal decision. The approach has been quite different in Queensland, as we will see, where the Queensland courts have continued to resist the importance of Scope 3. So far as the Commonwealth courts, so the federal court, have dealt with projects that involve the emission of carbon, those courts have also taken an approach which is much more like the Queensland approach in terms of not treating Scope 3 emissions as an emission of a coal mining project. Now, you probably appreciate already that the volumes of carbon emissions from a coal mining project distributed between the three scopes is not even at all. So something like 98% of the carbon emissions from a coal mining project are Scope 3 emissions, and the other 2% are the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So it's a critical issue whether Scope 3 emissions are included in the impacts of the mine, and thus subject to environmental impact assessment, as we will see. For a long time, the New South Wales court struggled with the question of whether this statutory obligation of environmental and planning decision makers to consider the public interest carried with it the necessity to consider the impacts of climate change. And that was really only settled, hopefully for good, by Chief Justice Preston's judgment in the Gloucester decision in 2019. That issue has, you know, the legislation that creates that obligation to consider public interest is decades old, and the issue has swerved backward and forward over that period. It seems, in retrospect, unbelievable, doesn't it, that the impacts of climate change could be anything but public interest. Anyway, is a legal obligation to have regard to any applicable state or national policy, say the climate change policy framework, is that a policy that has to be considered if there is an obligation to have regard to policies and programs concerning greenhouse gas emissions. Now that's, you would think this would be another obvious question, that obviously a climate change policy framework is a policy relevant to greenhouse gas emissions that would have to be considered. But the courts struggled with the idea of whether the decision maker who is actually giving the approval for the project has the legal authority to implement the policy framework, climate change policy framework, and so therefore it's not an applicable state or national policy because it's a policy the decision maker has no authority to apply. So that's all very subtle, isn't it? And you would obviously not be passionate about climate change issues if you found it was not applicable, I would have to suggest. Okay, so some more paradoxes from the courts. Is it relevant to evaluate greenhouse gas emissions when the decision maker is required to consider the principles of ecologically sustainable development? So the legislation says the decision maker shall, in the course of making this decision, consider the principles of ecologically sustainable development. Do they have to consider greenhouse gas emissions? Well, it took a long time to arrive at the limited response that yes, they should consider greenhouse gas emissions, but then only in respect of the actual activities that the decision maker is permitting or approving or disapproving, and not in respect of Scope 3 emissions, which are produced through the activities of other actors. Impacts of climate change on matters of national environmental significance protected by the Commonwealth Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act are not direct impacts of the emissions of the greenhouse gases from mining and burning of coal that is implicit in a proposed project, according to the federal court to this point. So that they don't trigger environmental impact assessment of those impacts. There is also a decision that Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions from coal mining are not significant for the purposes of environment protection under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act by a federal court judge. And then Scope 3 emissions have no direct impact. This is from a Queensland court. So there is no serious or irreversible impact requiring application of the precautionary principle. So the Australian courts have accepted that there are threshold requirements before the precautionary principle applies, that there is a serious or irreversible impact on the environment. But if you exclude Scope 3 emissions from coal mining projects, then there is no serious or irreversible impact of opening up the coal mine, certainly not on the basis of carbon emissions, and so the precautionary principle doesn't apply. So that's, as I said, the Queensland decision. Okay, so turning now to merits review, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions of mining and combustion of the mined coal are not emissions created by the proposed project, but emissions created by the activities of other actors. That was accepted in Queensland, the Queensland Land Court. That the tribunal or the other decision maker reviewing environmental authorisation is restricted to reviewing activities that are being authorised, and so again can't consider Scope 3 emissions unless there's an express authority to do that. This is just that point's the same as the one considered in judicial review, I think. And then I think this is the last one, the market substitution argument, also known as the drug dealer's defence. One commentator described it as that there would be no net increases of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere from any one coal project, because if the market demand for coal is not met by that proposed mine, it will be met by a supply of coal from elsewhere. Thus, there will be no increase in Scope 3 emissions. So if I can't mine the coal, someone else will mine coal somewhere else, maybe in Brazil. That coal will be burned and we'll still have the same impact on carbon emissions globally. So really, approval of my coal mine will have no impact on carbon emissions. That has been accepted in judicial review in Queensland by the Court of Appeal in Queensland and merits review in Queensland, and it was also until the decision of Chief Justice Preston in the Gloucester decision, it was a kind of a decision that tended to swerve around the place in New South Wales around as well, the market substitution argument. The COPEC decision in the Court of Appeal, just handed down on Tuesday, passed over a market substitution argument, just simply leaving in place the original decision maker's conclusion that there was no evidence that someone else would mine coal and emit into the atmosphere in the court, so they couldn't base a conclusion on it. Okay, well,
Murray, can
yes?
I just step in? We're just running out of time. Could you give you another minute or so?
Yeah, just a couple of minutes. You can, if you're interested in this point, you can pursue it in my paper, which you can download. Basically, in this section, I was looking at the reactions to climate change litigation. So when you have seen how conservative the courts have been in climate change litigation in the past until really this year in New South Wales, or well, 2019, Chief Justice Preston's decision in Gloucester. But even if there is a contrary decision in the courts, that is a disapproval of a proposed carbon project, the political and media fields have engaged in the issue and proposed to change the law to prevent similar decisions being made again. So pre-green tape reduction bills, attempts to prevent environmentalists having the right to go to court. Member Smith, an otherwise conservative decision maker in merits review in the Land Court in Queensland, suffered very prejudicial comment in an article in The Australian and resigned. So there is a lot riding on the way that judges operate in this area as well. So if you're interested in those political ramifications of the decisions, then they're in the paper. Okay, well, I've just to go back to my main points, Australia has enormous potential to exploit renewable energy and develop and export climate-friendly technologies. Climate litigation challenges have gone against environmental assessment and approval of projects that limit greenhouse gas. Until very recently, the results were mixed, partly because of the conservatism of courts in interpreting the underlying law, particularly when it's common law. ideally, this would be dealt with proactively in the political sphere, but that's not possible. And the way that it's been dealt with at a national level suggests to us that it might be better, especially if the leadership of New South Wales is followed by other states, being left with the states. In any case, there is a lot of scope for trade and international relations, and we look forward to the Glasgow Conference of the Parties to prevent the distortion of markets and to achieve an international standard that Australia can adhere to that is more rigorous than those that we're pursuing. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak. I hope you found that interesting and informative. Okay.
Thanks, Murray. That was fascinating. Just going to get things rolling along. Nicholas, I invite you to give the European perspective before Ben gives his commentary. Nicholas, I'm going to be kind of mean and ask you to truncate your speech or your presentation to around 15 minutes to allow time for a commentary and panel discussion. I don't know if that's possible. Let's be ambitious. Over to you, Nicholas.
Yes, I'm unable to start the video. Yes. Okay. Yes. So I'm just going to try to complement Murray's speech. Okay. Yes. So I'm teaching also comparative law as Murray did, and so the key difficulties I've been facing in writing this publication for the ANU Center for European Studies. So both of papers are being already posted on the ANU Center. So you can contact Mrs. William Cassia to obtain the copies of our publications. So of course I will just try to summarize what I did, but before that, as you're aware, the coal industry in Europe today is mostly limited to some Central European countries, mostly Poland. There have been few litigation in contrast to Australia, and lately there's been an interstate litigation that took place before the Court of Justice of the European Union in Luxembourg, a case opposing Czechia against Poland about the extension of a huge mine in Turlow, southwest Poland, along the border with Czechia, and Czech authorities complain before the Court of Justice of the European Union that the Polish authorities did not carry out an impact assessment. So they've just been extending the mine, the authorization, granting an authorization with a view to expanding the mine without carrying out a proper impact assessment. And the Court of Justice in Luxembourg ruled against the Polish authorities, say, well, a study had to be carried out before granting the authorization. So that case is not really spectacular. But on the western side of Europe, given that most of the coal mines were closed in the 50s or in early 60s, there are no more litigation. Nevertheless, the litigation is taking place between citizens and the foundation, NGOs, against state authorities on the account that many member states in the west of the EU don't succeed to comply with the trajectory of diminishing the greenhouse gases emitted not only by the plants we have been commenting upon, Ivan Adamjanovic and myself, but also by transport, agriculture, recreations, householding. In my speech, I shall focus on human rights. Firstly, two key human rights embedded in the 1950 Paris Convention on Human Rights that was adopted under the auspices of the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is another organization than the European Union, and this is the right to life, embedded in Article 2, and the right to privacy and family life. And these rights have been taken into consideration by the Dutch Supreme Court and by the Belgian Civil Court in Brussels in cases opposing thousands of claimants and the NGOs and the national authorities. And the claimants were arguing that the two authorities in Belgium and the Netherlands did not comply with their international and EU obligation in carrying out a genuine, ambitious policies consistent with these obligations. The second part of my speech is about the German ruling made by the Bundesverfassungsgericht, the German Constitutional Court, where the court did not reckon upon Article 2 and 8, but they reckon upon all the fundamental constitutional rights embedded in the Grundgesetz, in the German constitution. So here we are facing two different perspectives, which are to some extent complementary. First slide, please. So the Dutch case, known as Urgenda case, which is the name of the NGO, the claimants sought an injunction from the first Court of Instance, the Court of Appeal, and lately the Supreme Court in Den Haag, the capital of the Netherlands, to achieve a 25% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by the end of last year, whilst the Dutch authorities were ready to achieve merely a 20% reduction of greenhouse gases, because to comply with the 25% reductions entails significant costs, in particular with respect to industry and transport, which are key drivers of the Dutch economy. So here there was a wrangling about claimants at risk of floodings for the rising of the sea, and the Dutch authorities that were veering toward a much more cautious approach in not hindering, in not jeopardizing the Dutch economies in pursuing a much more ambitious reductions. The Belgian case relates to civil liability, or in common law, tort liability, the tort of negligence, where the claimants were seeking the responsibility of the Belgian authorities of not conducting, of not developing a proper climate change authority. And I will begin firstly with the Urgenda case. Next slide, please. Where the court of first of instance and then the Court of Appeal decided in favor of the victims, of the potential victim of the risk. And the Supreme Court in Urgenda had to address a number of extremely complex cases, because it was the first major case that had to be decided with respect to human rights and climate change risks. So unlike technological risk, where the neighbors of the plants or the neighbor of the nuclear installations have close connections with the source of the risk, here we are dealing with potential victims, which are kind of long-term victims. They are unable to identify exactly the dike that's likely to break and a part of the lands that's likely to be flooded. Just by reminder, 1/3 of the Netherlands is below the sea level and is likely to be flooded in a few centuries from now. So with respect to this untargeted risk, the concept of risk and risk of damage and victim has been interpreted really broadly by the three levels of the Dutch court. So the Dutch court acknowledged that they are dealing with something, a situation is completely different from industrial and technological risk, where the link of causation can be easily identified, but nevertheless, they unanimously endorse interpretation that victim and risk must be interpreted broadly in favor of the potential victim. Next slide, please. So what matters is that human rights law requires the states not to promote adaptation or harm reduction, but to mitigate, to fight the risk at the source in placing obligations upon authorities and private persons, obliging them to reduce their emissions. Uncertainty regarding the speed at which the phenomena is going to occur that the population, the communities at risk cannot be exactly identified does not undermine the duty of care stemming from the right to life and the right to privacy. And this measure must, according to the Dutch Supreme Court, involve a 25% reduction instead of a 20% reductions. And though the state has some margin of appreciation to determine the manner in which this target is going to be achieved, there is no margin of appreciation whatsoever to postpone compliance with the 25% reduction target, because this reduction target is stemming from international obligations. Next slide, please. The Belgian Civil Court is a completely different approach. It relies upon tort law. As you're aware, tort law has been codified in Western Europe thanks to Napoleon Bonaparte in 1804 with the enactment of le Code civil des Français. And one of the key provisions that every student knows in Western Europe is Article 382 of the Civil Code, according to which any act, whatever of man, which cause damage to another, oblige him, by whose fault it occurred, to make reparation. So it's quite easy to understand. There must be a fault, there must be a long link of causation with a damage, and the damage must be repaired. So every victim has a subjective right to claim compensation for the damage caused by the fault. Of course, here we are not dealing with actual damages. The damage might occur in 20, 30, 40 years from now as a matter of flooding, as a matter of forest fires, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, 58,000 claimants, 58 trees, as well an NGO, Klimaatzaak, went to court to seek the condemnation of the Belgian state authorities for breaching Article 382 of the Belgian Civil Code. Next slide, please. And the court in Brussels ruled that the Belgian authorities committed three negligence or three omissions. Firstly, they failed to meet the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, like the Dutch authorities. The Dutch authorities endorse a kind of cautious approach. Instead of achieving 25% reductions, they went up to 20%. The Belgian approach has been utterly chaotic, and they delivered mixed results. So some greenhouse gas reductions from plants. However, the emissions from household and transport have been exploding. There's been a shortage or lack of an absence of good climate governance for the complexity of the Belgian state. And finally, the European Commission has been warning the Belgian state that they were departing from the EU obligations. So the Belgian authorities did not act as a bonus pater familias, as a good father, as a good family father, within the purpose of Article 382. So these omissions entail the civil liability of the public authorities. The claimants have been requesting also an award for an injunctions, and it's a bit similar reasoning than in the Anjali Sharma judgment that Murray Raff has been commented. The Brussels Civil Court, like Justice Bromberg, declined to award the injunctions that would constrain the public authorities to follow a particular path, and that's the issue of the separation of powers. So the civil court can condemn as a matter of liability the state authorities, but the civil judge cannot decide a part of conduct on behalf of the state authorities. Next slide, please. And so that's really highlight the limits of the intervention of the courts in these extremely complicated climate cases. In the Netherlands, the Hoge, the Supreme Court, decided that there was no breach of the principle of separation of powers between the courts and the parliament, because the protection of fundamental rights was an essential element of the democratic state governed by the rule of law. However, the Belgian court did decline to award the injunction sought by the claimants. So what really matters is the key principle of separation of powers. Next slide, please. So what can we extract from this? The two provisions have direct effect, be it regarding the review of the proper conduct by the state authorities of the climate change policy. The scope of discretion left to the authorities is diminished. The authorities can decide the venue through which they will address the problem, but they cannot call into question, they cannot postpone the targets that has been decided at international level or at EU level. And of interest, civil liability can play a role. So in not conducting a proper climate change policy, the state authorities incur liability on the long term. Next slide, please.
Can I interject, Nicholas, and ask you to wind up in the next 2 minutes to give Ben some time to provide a commentary? Thank you.
Yeah. So the German case, it's a bit easier. It's a constitutional review by the Constitutional Court, and that was decided not in relation to Article 2 and 8, but to all rights enshrined in the German Constitution. Next slide, please. So the Climate Act was postponing the long-term efforts without any proper guidance. So the government was endowed with much leeway in deciding what to do between 2020 and 2030. So the claimants were criticizing the lawmaker for not complying with Article 20 of the German Constitution, which is the environmental clause of the German Constitution. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I have to hurry up. And interestingly enough, the German court decided that the protection of life and the right to property were encompassing a duty to protect citizens against climate hazards. So it was not only environmental matters or traditional environmental risk, but also long-term climate hazard. Next slide, please. And the provisions, the legislative provisions were likely to impinge upon all the constitutional freedoms. So we are not restricted here to the right to life or the right to privacy, but climate change policy can impact the freedom of association, the freedom of speech, the freedom of practicing one's religion. So the scope, the ambit is much broader than in the two previous judgments. Next slide, please. And so what matters, and I will conclude here, is that the German authorities cannot spend the whole CO2 budget in the 10 coming years. Before 2030, the CO2 budget has to be spent with a view to safeguarding intergenerational equity. So the lawmaker has to think truly about long-term planning and not depriving the forthcoming generations or children or grandchildren of the residual CO2 budget. Can you move to the conclusion, please? And I will conclude with this. Yes, next. So what matters is that here in all these cases we find that scientific imperatives and international obligations play a role in the discretionary powers of the state authorities are shrinking. Courts take into consideration EU law, international law, customary law, soft law, but also scientific reports. And last slide, please. And precautionary principle has been invoked by a number of the Supreme Courts. So, of course, state authorities are facing a significant level of uncertainty, but they are also obliged by the precautionary principle to take into consideration this uncertainty. So uncertainties cannot preclude the intervention of state authorities. And that's the real sense of the precautionary principle we discussed in the course of the 1980s and 1990s. And finally, and that's linked to the discussions, the previous discussion, the fact that the phenomena is global does not undermine, does not preclude the state responsibility. Each state, be it the Netherlands, be it Germany, be it Belgium, is responsible to comply with the international and EU obligations and in complying with the trajectory in order to limit the release of greenhouse gases. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nicholas. Ben, can you provide a commentary, please? And then after that, we'll invite Ivana to make her concluding comments.
Great. Thank you very much, Murray and Nicholas. I've got the most fun part. I got to read your papers and hear your very interesting expert views on these critical topics. And I get to think about it, talk about it without having to do all that fundamental research. Thank you very much for outstanding presentations, both of you. As I look at what the two professors have presented, I have a couple of different views, and thank you both for providing your papers well in advance, so I've had opportunity to read them both. And I look at at least two major issues here. And one of the broad bits of thinking that I see underlying the papers and made explicit somewhat is the question of governance, and where we're looking at governance and we think of it in terms of a coordination or three governance institutions, the legislature, executive, and courts. Looking at how those three governance institutions sort of interact and are balancing each other out, or working, I think, in a sense, as our political philosophers would have hoped. So, in the sense that there's not an unbridled executive, or that the legislature is not without interpretation, self-interpreting, and the judiciary, not setting the laws or making policy. So when we look at how the governance around this space is working, I think that these papers illustrate particularly the role of the courts in contributing to governance. So I think that at times people tend to think of the courts as sort of a one-off type corner of specialization, and there's not enough attention paid to the critical and integral role of courts in terms of governance, in terms of working with the other two institutions of government in achieving policy outcomes. So that's one thing that I think is very interesting about these papers. I think another bit, and this is interesting because it comes through Professor Raff Murray's presentation in Australia, as well as Nicholas's presentation in Europe, is that these pieces of litigation are fundamentally responses, citizen responses to the failure of executive government, the failure of our elected officials to respond to what is clearly, the language is there, a climate emergency, a climate crisis. It doesn't bode well I think, for confidence in democratic countries where we see the democratically elected officials ignoring what is clearly a public mandate. And so when we're looking at these decisions, and I think about the decisions that Murray has reviewed for us in Australia, where we see particularly the interaction between the corporations and environmental regulatory authorities, where the regulatory authorities seem too often captured or walking a little too closely with the carbon emitting companies. So the ministers, the executive arm of government, too closely attached to the commercial interests, that it's unable to, I think, follow through what would seem to be clear mandates, clear public good mandates. So for example, Murray's talked about these questions of public interest. How can you not have public interest in scope 3 how can you not have public interest include the impacts on the public of these massive carbon emissions? So I think that these papers illustrate that in the context of companies with Murray's work and with Nicholas's work, again, looking at the authorities, not just the executive, but I think more broadly, how government as a whole is working or not working to address this climate change issue. So it makes me think, if I take what we've looked at, the different pieces of litigation that both of our scholars have put forward to us, I thought of really what we're trying to achieve with this litigation. So one is certainly a failure of the executive government. It's a failure of the legislative arm of government as well. And so what then can we think of, if we think about those different pieces of litigation? So is it compensation for injury? There's almost like a taxonomy, 4 types of lawsuits being brought. The compensation for injury, there's an effort to force government to develop appropriate climate change legislation, to force executive government into action, or to force the legislature to develop, although we've seen particularly with the Australian litigation, where the conservative legislatures or conservative-led legislatures, instead of picking up a court decision saying, my goodness, we're not actually dealing with it enough. In fact, they narrow the court's discretion even further. Is it the litigation aimed to stop climate change? That's a separate issue, and you see this, for example, very nicely done in the German case. Or you can say, are we litigating for purposes of changing corporate investment decisions? If we can make it uneconomical to extract these carbon deposits, as Murray says, through something like a carbon tax, require an internalization of scope 1, 2, and 3 costs, well, then if the companies have to internalize them, they're not going to be investing in them, and those assets will become stranded assets, and that will put an end to it. So I think that those objectives of litigation, then you can sort of say, well, how are these different bits working? So you've got the companies on the one hand, you've got the federal and state politicians, the executive, you've got the activists, and you've got the courts doing the adjudication. And when you look at this range of 4 actors, you almost get a bit of a matrix. And you can see how that matrix, in a sense, coincides with those different objectives of the litigation. And I think that Murray's paper sort of deals with perhaps more common law concerns that way, that interaction between the private actors, the companies, and the federal politicians. And Nicholas's civil law cases or approaches tends to, in my view, or and this is probably just a very rough, or perhaps too much of a generalization, tends to be more activist focused or more activist driven. And again, I mean, both of them are working with the courts. It's not that Australia hasn't had effective environmental litigation by environmental activists. And Murray, of course, was instrumental in setting up the environmental defense body in Victoria. But just trying to think about how these different legal systems deal with this failure of executive and legislative government. The last comment I make, because we're well over time, and I'd buy everybody drinks. I can say that because I'm far enough away and I'll never have to do it if we were going to stay longer. But I just wanted to point out how interesting it is, the two presentations, where in terms of the legal approaches. And so Murray's referred to the Australian system, how we've done it in Australia, where we've looked at judicial review on both a merits review and judicial review. We've done litigation judicial review and merits review, and as well as the civil liability, which is just starting to bubble up and starting to generate some success, particularly with the Sharma case. So that's fairly new to us. And I think it reflects, in a sense, the common law approach, where the state is not considered, particularly in neoliberal government and regulatory state models, where the state has, really stepped back from doing its job of governing, to what you see in Nicholas's approach, where he's provided, I think, a very, very interesting look at how this has been dealt with in Europe. We've got the Netherlands with a human rights approach, and there's not a concern about that separation of powers. So essentially the court saying, look, executive and legislature are not doing their job, fine, we bypass them. How do we do that? We do human rights, which goes over and above the machinations of the government of the day. So very interesting solution to that problem. It's the separation of powers problem has seen Australia tripping all over itself. So these are smart ideas out of the EU. The Belgian case was interesting. The civil liability approach, which is what we've tried to deal with here in Sharma in Australia, that seemed to get stuck on the separation of powers issue. And that's an issue in the Sharma case, which the courts are unhappy, and rightly so, unhappy or uncertain about fettering the discretion of ministers. So that civil liability has those problems, but you see the other approach in the German constitutional case in section 20A of the Constitution, where again, the courts have been able to provide a solution that extends beyond what the politician's number one concern, which is, how do I get elected? How do I keep my job for 3 or 4 more years? So the ability of the courts to provide that long-term governance view to contribute to the longer-term governance of our countries, of our nations, and ultimately of the globe by dealing with climate change, the courts are, in a sense, ideally positioned to do so because they're not dependent on the whims of the electorate. Now, having said that, the courts, as Murray has pointed out, and I find this interesting, it seems to be somewhat different in civil law systems, but in the common law world, they're very much backwards looking, and they provide remedial approach to issues rather than much forward. And despite the efforts in environmental legislation to be forward looking, they're still more ex post rather than ex ante. And this to me is kind of one of the promising bits that comes out of the European litigation, is that the courts seem to be able to deal more effectively with taking on what are fundamental in international environmental law principles, precautionary principles, and they can be looking ex ante and pointing out these are targets, these are international legal commitments that we need to actually achieve, rather than the type of unbelievable statements that come from our Prime Minister about how we will magically, the end of 2029, suddenly meet the 2030 goal, or at a canter is the language that's used. But I don't think it's credible anywhere outside of his little echo chamber. I think those are my comments. As I'm very mindful of the time, I would like to thank both of the speakers, Professor Raff, Professor de Satelaere, for outstanding papers, and I encourage the other conference members to have a read and think about them, regardless of your approach or your thinking about it. They're both outstanding pieces of scholarship, very informative. And thank you, Ivana, for the opportunity to comment and respond, and Darren for chairing the session.
All right, thank you so much, Ben, and thanks to both speakers in the second session of part 2. And I wish to also at the end thank our audience for staying with us. I think we had very interesting discussions both in part 1 and part 2. And I wish to take the opportunity to thank all my colleagues from UC, University of Canberra, the Expert Council of Australia, and the ANU Centre for European Studies. So much has been said, and I just want to have to put forward a few take-home messages. So trade has an important role to play in addressing climate change, and free riding and climate fairness are the two main issues behind the difficulties in reaching meaningful international agreements on reducing emissions. Cbam looks at addressing the problem of the free rider in a manner that will not discriminate between countries, but will focus on products and their production processes. So in that sense, Cbam complements other climate-friendly approaches in international trade, including a liberalization of environmental goods and services. So it's not either or, but it's and. And while the effect of Cbam on Australia would be negligible, of importance is to look at the bigger picture. And with Cbam, really the EU looks to have a worldwide impact on other countries to act in addressing climate change. And it is yet another example of the Brussels effect. So the effect which refers to the process of de facto externalization of EU regulation outside the borders of the EU through market mechanisms. Most importantly, the proposal foresees alliances with third countries. So the EU is likely to use Cbam as a leverage in talks with climate partners, trying to persuade other countries to introduce carbon mechanisms alike. But of course, the EU will likely proceed on its own track if it finds progress abroad too slow. Anyway, we're looking forward to following these developments and future discussions, and please stay tuned with this project and our activities. And thank you once again for your participation, and have a good evening, everyone.